Welcome to Safe on Deck. For episode 37, I sat down with Captain Robert Hoot Gibson at his home in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Hoot joined the United States Navy in 1969, and following flight training, he was assigned to Fighter Squadron 111, flying the legendary F-4B Phantom II in combat over Southeast Asia. Next, Hoot joined Fighter Squadron 1 and transitioned to the F-14A Tomcat, where he was selected to attend the prestigious United States Navy Fighter Weapons School, known as TOPGUN. Hoot then completed the United States Naval Test Pilot School before serving a tour as an F-14 test pilot at the Naval Air Test Center's Strike Aircraft Test Directorate. Hoot joined NASA as an astronaut candidate in January of 1978, and he went on to fly 5 missions aboard the Space Shuttle, including as pilot on STS-41B and commander on STS-61C, STS-27, STS-47, and STS-71, the first Space Shuttle mission to dock with the Russian space station Mir. Hoot served as chief of the Astronaut Office from 1992 to 1994 and retired from NASA in 1996. Hoot is a prolific general aviation pilot and air racer. And in September of 2015, he won the National Championship Air Race Gold Unlimited class, flying a highly modified P-51 nicknamed Strega. Hoot has logged 36.5 days in space and is an active aviator with over 14,000 hours of flight time in 162 types of aircraft to date. And his numerous individual military decorations include the Defense Distinguished Service Medal and the Distinguished Flying Cross. Thanks for taking the time to listen. In the future, I plan to continue to share similar interviews with both current and retired military aviators. If you have a question or a suggestion for a future interview, please leave it as a comment below. Safe on Deck, episode 37, with Captain Robert Hoot Gibson. Enjoy. Hoot, to say it's an honor is absolutely an understatement. It is truly, truly a pleasure. Thank you so very much for taking so much time, making the schedules line up and making it so that we could sit down and chat. Start all these interviews the same way, so I wanted to start yours the same way as well. Where were you born?
I was born in Cooperstown, New York, the home of baseball. And my parents were aviation parents. Mom and dad were both pilots, which is how they met. And so they followed the aerospace industry around in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And so at the time that I was born, my dad was managing an airport that used to exist in Cooperstown, although it wasn't actually in Cooperstown. It was just outside of the city limits. It was in a place called Fly Creek, but it was known as the Cooperstown Airport. And so that's where I was born.
I always ask, what's the first bite on aviation? But it sounds like literally the family, mom and dad, right?
Absolutely, yes. And mom was kind of a unique bird. And she was a teacher. She graduated from teacher college, which back in those days, you know, women could be teachers or secretaries, it seems like. And so she graduated from a teacher's college, and she and 2 of her girlfriends from the school decided they were going to learn how to fly. And if you're going to learn how to fly, you got to have an airplane. So the 3 of them went out and bought a J2 Taylor Cub for $900. This would have been about 1943. So she was taking flying lessons, and that's how she met my dad.
Did you get to fly in that airplane later in life?
No, I didn't. I don't know where that airplane went. Of course, it was owned by 3 of them. So we were only in Cooperstown. I was a year and a half old when they moved from Cooperstown, because the airport was more than rudimentary. It had I think it had 2 grass runways, short grass runways. It didn't have a proper hangar. It had a cover. And this is upstate New York, and winters in upstate New York. My dad endured, I think, 1.5 winters or maybe 2 winters. And at the end of that, he said, I can't do this. And so they headed for California at that point.
Where in California?
Where they initially went was Santa Ana, and my dad had found a job at El Toro. He had been a mechanic in addition to being a pilot. Had his, did he have his A&P license then? Yes, he did. He had his aircraft and power plant license. So he found a job as a mechanic at El Toro in Santa Ana.
Having both mom and dad in aviation, I think incredibly blessed. What kind of lessons did they teach you? Because I'll be honest, my family, a little bit of aviation background, but folks worked on aircraft, and my grandfather, one of his designs as part of the lunar lander that remains on the moon today, something I'm incredibly proud of, that connection to space flight. But no one was a pilot, so I was very fortunate that I had a lot of support from my family, but I was kind of the first one to go out and get a license, and my brother followed, and we were fortunate to have a plane now. But having a mom and dad that are in it, what lessons did they teach you that you looked back on later in life and said, man, I'm really glad mom and dad were the ones that taught me that early?
Oh, it really was a blessing. And I am fond of saying that if I have been successful as an aviator, it's because my dad was the one that taught me. He was an aeronautical engineer and then a test pilot. He got his aeronautical engineering degree when I was 10 years old. And I remember being at his graduation. I remember hearing Paul Alexander Gibson announced and Dad walking across the stage to get his aeronautical engineering degree. And so he's the one that taught me how to fly. He didn't just teach me how, since he was an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot, he taught me the why as well. He taught me aerodynamics. He taught me about structural ramifications and all of the above. And he was such an excellent instructor. Like I say, I'm fond of saying if I have been successful, it's because of him. Mom also, I flew with her. I guess maybe air racing was in the blood because she flew in the all-women's transcontinental air race, also known as the Powder Puff Derby, 3 times, and she never placed very high. She was flying a Cessna 140 the first year that she did it, and then I think the other 2 years a Cessna 170. And of course, she was a conservative flyer. I remember I went out with her one time when she was practicing, and of course it was all VOR navigation, and so went out with her for, golly, it was about a 2-hour flight, and she was practicing in California, flying to some of these waypoints. So I learned a lot about flying, and one of my earliest stories that I recall, I was about 5 years old, and my dad and I were flying a J3 Piper Cub, and he was letting me fly it. And I was having a great time. So I'm on the stick and I'm flying the airplane around, and he let me fly it back into the traffic pattern in the airport. Had me enter the downwind leg, had me turn onto base leg, and then onto final, and then he said, okay, let me fly it now. Well, I was bummed because I wasn't tired of flying it yet. I wanted to fly it some more, so I sat there, and then I said, to myself, I'm going to fly it some more. So I got on the stick right as we're in the final flare, and I got my butt chewed out, not just by Dad, although very politely, but Mom. Mom chewed me out as well and said, you don't ever do that. When somebody else is flying the airplane, you stay off the controls. So, we learn from good things and we learn from bad things. And so that was one of the lessons I learned very early.
Why naval aviation? Vietnam was raging. There was a lot of different aviation opportunity, the Army, the Air Force, literally every branch was out there. But why naval aviation?
Golly, from the time I was 10 years old, I want to be an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot. I want to be my dad. I know it was hero worship of Dad, and I was in my 4th year of aeronautical engineering, and I had a problem here. I went to a community college for 2 years on Long Island because my dad was based out of JFK then with the FAA, and I went to 2 years of engineering science and then transferred into the California university system. Well, I was lacking a course. Nobody in this community college, there had not been enough people that passed the prerequisites for strength of materials, which is given at the end of your 2nd year. I didn't have that course, so they waived it and gave me my associate degree in engineering science. But now I got into Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, California, and I didn't have strength of materials, so I couldn't start the stress analysis sequence, which is a 3rd year course. So I'm not going to graduate in 4 years. Well, that's a problem. Everything you did as a young man in the 60s was controlled by the draft board, and I wasn't going to graduate in 4 years. And so they said, well, since you're not going to graduate in 4 years, therefore you are not making normal progress towards a degree, so you are hereby classified 1A. And then very shortly after that, I appealed it. They overrode my appeal 3-0. I got my draft notice and I said, I am about to lose one of my big dreams, which is to be an aeronautical engineer. And I wasn't smart enough. I didn't know better. So first thing I did was I walked downtown and I walked into the Air Force recruiter. And the Air Force recruiter wasn't any help at all. He said, okay, well, where are you in college? He says, when are you going to graduate? I said, well, that's the problem. I'm not going to. I'm going to get yanked out of aeronautical engineering. And he said, well, yeah, you got a real problem there. But we don't talk to anybody unless you're within 6 months of graduating. So if you can get yourself to within 6 months of graduating, come back and see us again. So I walk out of that building and I'm already feeling the rice paddies around my feet. And I walk down the road to the Navy recruiter. And I walked in and the Navy recruiter, first question he says is, what's your draft status? I said, 1A. he pulls out this form letter that says something to the tune of, "Dear rotten, slimy draft board, keep your grubby paws off this guy. We're considering him for an aviation program." The chief signs the bottom of it, slides it over to me, and says, "Sign where it says your name is supposed to be." I signed it. He folds it up, puts it in his mail outgoing box, and said, "Okay, this gives us 3 months to process you." I am impressed immediately. It's kind of a long-winded story, but that's how I wound up in the Navy. And in hindsight, having known a whole bunch of Air Force aviators, I don't think I would have done as well in the Air Force.
Why is that?
The Air Force, the guys have a mentality that we can't afford in the Navy. I'll give an example. Let's say you've got a mission to North Vietnam, and they brief the mission, and in the Air Force briefing, one of the flight leaders or the squadron commander is going to say, "Okay, that's not enough tankers. We need more tankers. We need more of this. We need more of that." And they say, "Okay, all right, well, we'll have to hold off until we can round up those tankers for you." In the Navy, you're out on an aircraft carrier, and they say, "Here's what we're going to have." You could hold your hand up and say, "There's no tankers on this one. We need tankers." And the answer is going to be, "Hey, guys, this is what we've got. Make it work." The guys that prosper in the Navy are the ones that can make it work. The guys that prosper in the Air Force are the ones that can memorize every little regulation and every little rule. And let's say you take off on the mission and you're on your way to the target and you bump into an ops doctrine that in order to complete the mission, you might have to bend that ops doctrine a little bit. The Air Force will abort the mission. The Navy, you will see if you can work around it. Maybe it's a weather problem. Maybe you've got to punch through a little bit of weather on your way to the target. And you'll come back and you might tell your ops officer, "Hey, we had to kind of bend our doctrine a little bit to do this." And he'd say, "Well, okay, we'll try not to do it again." Those are the ones that prosper. And in the Air Force, the ones who can remember all the little nitpicky rules and never bend a rule. Abort a mission if you have to, but don't bend a rule. And so I saw that in the space program, and there's a parallel there. When you get up in orbit, you've got everything you're going to have. You can whine at mission control, and you can say, "Well, hey, we don't have enough fuel, or we don't have enough, we don't have a checklist for that, or we don't. Hey, guys, you've got everything you're going to have. Make it work."
Before we started recording, you talked about the first, I'm guessing first jet you flew was the T-2A, correct?
Yes.
And I think now we take for granted, I have all of 2 rides in a Super Hornet, greatest, oh gosh, what a wonderful experience. But we take for granted the fact that when you stand those engines up in the corner, the airplane moves. I was wondering maybe if you could tell that story about the T-2 and what it was like taking off in the, maybe, I won't say the early generation, but one of those earlier generations of jets.
I'll never forget my first flight in a T-2, because prior to that, I had flown with my dad in a number of airplanes. He was FAA, and back in those days, he could take me along when he had one of the FAA airplanes. So I've been with him in the Twin Beach C-45. I didn't get to do takeoffs and landings in that because that was a squirrely airplane. That took a real pilot to fly that thing, the ground handling. But I got to fly that a bunch. They also had Queen Airs, which is a King Air with piston engines. I got to fly those. He took me out in different helicopters and all, but I had never been over 200 knots. And I'll never forget my first takeoff in the T-2. And it was interesting how slow the engine was. It was the J-34, 3,000 pounds of thrust, maybe 3,400 pounds of thrust. But the procedure was you got on the runway, you held your brakes, you ran the throttle all the way to the throttle. They called it the PCL, power control lever. And it wasn't a power control lever. It's really a thrust control lever. Because as you know, if I'm putting out 3,400 pounds of thrust, but I'm not moving, I don't have any thrust horsepower. So it's not power, it's thrust. Anyway, you go to full power and you time it, how long it takes to get there. And as long as it was better than, I think it was 17 seconds, you were good to go. And no problem holding the brakes at full thrust. I'll never forget releasing the brakes, and it starts accelerating. And it just keeps accelerating. It didn't slap you back in the seat. It wasn't like a catapult shot, but it just kept accelerating through speeds that I had never seen before, right up to 250 knots. It was just a steady, steady acceleration, right up to 250. And then you climbed at 250 or you throttled back if you had to maintain 250. I was so impressed with my first flight in a jet. And of course, everything was smooth and quiet. You didn't have all this piston engine vibration and propeller vibration.
Tell me about the Phantom, the F-4.
The Phantom, at the time, I was so lucky to fly that. I got my first choice coming out of pilot training when I got my wings. I wanted Phantoms on the West Coast, and I got Phantoms out of Miramar. My folks were living in California, so I wanted to be near my folks. I knew that would put me in Vietnam, but you signed up for this, and that's what you're there to do. And so I was thrilled when I got F-4s. Now, I didn't have any kind of a pool at all going through pilot training, but I hit a big pool when I got to the F-4 RAG, VF-121 at Miramar. I spent 8 months before I got to fly the Phantom. Every so often, they would send us over to go fly under the bag in the TA-4J with VF-126, just to kind of keep your hand in a little bit. They would schedule us to go ride on a C-130 to get 3 hours of flight time in a C-130, riding in special crew time, but that kept you on flight pay. So I had an 8-month pool. So I got there February the 26th of 1971. I didn't fly my first flight in the F-4 until November of 71. Now, I did get to do something really valuable, and I'm not really answering your question yet, but I'll get there. I got to do something really valuable. I got tapped along with 2 other brand new Lieutenant JGs who were waiting to start flying. And guys were hanging out on the beach. There had been a guy that they found out who had gone to Acapulco and just stayed in Acapulco. He had a buddy of his picking up his paycheck and mailing it to him down there in Acapulco. I didn't get to do any of that. I got put to work. The F-14 project office had cranked up at Miramar, and myself and 2 other Lieutenant JGs got tapped to come work for the F-14 project office. This paid dividends much later when I got asked to come join the first Tomcat squadron by Commander Sam Leeds, who was the first commanding officer of VF-1, Fighter Squadron 1, in Tomcats. So I worked the whole time waiting to start flying the Phantom. And when I finally got to start flying the Phantom, at the time, this was the world's best all-around fighter. It was an attack airplane. We could carry off the Coral Sea, which had short catapults. We could carry 3,000 pounds of bombs and missiles and full fuel. And it was the world's best all-around fighter. And holy smokes, talk about horsepower. Compare a T-2A to an F-4. This was the F-4J. I was flying the F-4Js in VF-121. Man, oh man, supersonic jet. You could go supersonic in a climb in the F-4 Phantom. Now, I have to admit, I was a little scared of the slow speed characteristics of it at first because I'd been flying the TA-4J. Lightly wing-loaded, slow approach speed. The F-4 Phantom approach speed, about 147 knots. And at first, it just felt to me like I am balancing on a beach ball. You're just hanging in there. It's just waiting to sit there and stall. Well, one of the things that you had trained on was that the slats, the leading edge slats, and the trailing edge flaps had boundary layer control. Bleed air being drawn off the engine and blown on your leading edge slats and your trailing edge flaps, the thing would fly just reliably and completely predictable at slow speed, relatively slow speed as well. And so it took me a little getting used to that to kind of trust it at slow speed. But what a thrill that was to fly that airplane.
Who's the favorite Rio you flew with? And I'm wondering why. What was maybe a good story where you guys just kind of gelled all that training and that experience, it all came together and coalesced?
I guess I'd say my favorite Rio that I flew with was Joe Gatewood. And he was my Rio when he and I got selected to go through Top Gun. After my first cruise, I flew 55 combat missions. I joined the Coral Sea halfway through the 1971-1972 combat cruise. And that's when the Vietnam War busted wide open. North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam on March 30th of 1972 with 500 tanks and 10,000 troops. And it was a real, genuine World War II kind of war all of a sudden. I joined the squadron the next month, early in April. So it was a really intense. We started linebacker. We mined all the harbors of North Vietnam. We, the Coral Sea. The A6s and A7s carried mines. The bombing halt that had been in place since 1968 suddenly got canceled, and we ranged all over North Vietnam. I must have done fairly well adapting to combat over North Vietnam, and I got to go to Hanoi, Haiphong, Vinh, Thanh Hoa, all the hot spots that exist there, because I got picked to go to Top Gun, and I was a lieutenant junior grade. Top Gun would not accept a lieutenant junior grade pilot because their philosophy, their attitude was, you haven't had enough conditioning as a lieutenant junior grade. The reason they accepted me was that my ops officer was Jim Rulifson, who was one of the founders of Top Gun. And I was told later on about this that said, ordinarily they would, if they got a lieutenant junior grade pilot, they sent him back home. But since Jim Rulifson sent me, they let me go through Top Gun as a lieutenant junior grade. I think I was the first. There were 3 other pilots that were going through, so we had 4 crews, 4 Phantom crews. The other guys were all lieutenants. Like I say, I guess I must have done well enough that they thought that I could do that. So Joe Gatewood, kind of short, little bit stocky, call sign Fireplug, or just Plug for short. So he and I had great time together. Now in the F-14 Tomcat, my Rio was Lieutenant Junior Grade Ted Wills, call sign Termite, because he was a bit on the small side, and call sign Termite. He and I are still in contact, and let's see, last September, October, June, pick a month. Anyway, I got asked to come give the address at Long Island for the Tomcat reunion, commemorating the first flight of the Tomcat. Ted Wills came from North Carolina to be there when I was there. So he's my favorite Rio. Now, one of the best Rios I ever flew with, you didn't get to fly with him very much because everybody wanted to fly with him. Jim Lang, Rio, who was one of the founders of Top Gun as well.
What was Top Gun like? I'm guessing we built the school because of the losses in Vietnam were becoming unacceptable. There needed to be dedicated training to ensure that our combat aviators were going to be better prepared. But these are early days. These are things, literally there's a lot of great books that I've read about the genesis of Top Gun, but you were there. I'd rather hear from you than read a book.
Top Gun came into being, like you said, because our kill ratio in Vietnam was unacceptable. It was 2.5 to 1. Well, it had been something like 8 or 12 to 1 in the Korean War. So something changed. Well, yeah, something changed big time. And that was that the fighters weren't really fighters anymore. They were interceptors. And of course, we had radar-guided missiles. The F-4 Phantom had the Sparrow, radar-guided, long-range, 13-mile maximum range. And we had the Sidewinders. Dogfighting had become a lost art. We weren't doing that. We were interceptor pilots. And the ALT study, Captain ALT, A-U-L-T, was the one that put together this whole story, and basically he concluded dogfighting was a lost art. And so Top Gun sprang up to correct all that and get us accustomed with dogfighting once again and get us away from the long-range intercept attitude and that we had at the time. And so that brought about some really great things. And you probably know in 1972, when the war busted wide open again, the Navy's kill ratio was 12 or 18 to 1. The Air Force was still 2.5 to 1. After that happened, the Air Force started red flag, and we got away from the long-range interceptor mindset and back into the, hey, we're here to dogfight.
Speaking of a jet that both intercepts and dogfights, the F-14, you already mentioned that that's something you went on to fly. VF-1, the first cruise of that airplane, and I think the TF-30 engine, maybe that has some recollections in your brain. I was hoping maybe you could talk about the first time taking the Tomcat to war and maybe a little bit about the TF-30.
We had some real experiences being the first squadron. And of course, there were 2 first squadrons, VF-1, Fighter Squadron 1, and Fighter Squadron 2, the bounty hunters. But of course, we were VF-1, so we were the first. So we had some growing pains. And there were some things that happened to us. We had problems with the boat tail, which is the tail end of the airplane in between the 2 engines. Couldn't stand the acoustic fatigue and pieces were breaking off. So they had removed big chunks of our boat tails and they went on to redesign the whole boat tail later on. But we had some significant problems with the TF-30s. It was the TF-30-P412, and it should have been a done deal. The Air Force had used it in the F-111, so it had lots of experience. It had lots of time on the engine. It should have been a slam dunk. The Air Force doesn't operate it in a saltwater corrosive environment, but the Navy does. And so although the F-14 RAG had been in existence for a while, they hadn't seen any of this. We were the first squadron to take the Tomcat to sea. And so we left in September of 1974, and by January with all this operating in our saltwater environment, the TF-30s were starting to say, hey, we've had enough. I had launched on a night hop out of QB Point in the Philippines, and another pair of Tomcats had launched before that, and we heard on guard the call that, hey, we have an airplane in the water. That was January the 2nd, 1975. We lost our first F-14 Tomcat. The engine basically exploded, and it would throw the compressor blades in the first three stages. There were 3 fan stages and then the compressor stages. And near as they could figure, because the airplane went into something like 12,000 feet of water, so I don't believe it was ever recovered. But near as they could tell, it must have been a compressor blade came loose. And when that came loose, it would go right into the fuel cell and start a giant fire. So that was January the 2nd of 1975. 12 days later, we are sailing on the Enterprise. We were about to go around the world. We were going to get to do an around-the-world cruise. January the 14th, 12 days later, we are doing flight operations in the Straits of Malacca off Singapore, near Singapore and all. And our second F-14 blew up. And so from there, we progressed on into the Indian Ocean with F-14s grounded. It turned out, well, the theory was that it must have been saltwater intrusion and saltwater spray and all of that. The engines had never been tested for that. When we do a Navy engine, we do saltwater susceptibility. That had not been done for the F-111. So we had some real issues. We spent, I want to say we spent a month or 2 months in the Indian Ocean. And we were very gradually testing, evaluating all the fan blades and the compressor blades in our engines, doing eddy current tests on them. And once an engine was cleared for that, then we could fly that airplane. So I didn't fly very much in January, and I think on into February of 1975. So yeah, we definitely had growing pains. The other part that you asked about was combat. Combat in the F-14 Tomcat. Most people don't realize that the F-14s flew combat missions in Vietnam. This wasn't much combat. We flew combat air patrol overhead Saigon, April the 29th, 1975, the day Saigon fell. So that day, I had a 2.3-hour flight holding overhead Saigon, just in case anything happened. We had all the H-53s coming in to pick up all of our people and get them out of there that day. And they called it a combat mission. So I got green ink on that entry in my logbook as well. There wasn't any shooting. I didn't see any shooting at all. I didn't see any radar returns, from SAMs. You'd worry about them bringing a SAM site down there or something. I think they just wanted to let us get our folks and get out of their hair. And so it was called the combat mission. It turned out to be my final carrier landing. I hadn't planned on that, but when we finished that cruise, when we finished that day, we had been extended a month to help cover the evacuation. When we finished that day, we sailed back to the Philippines, picked up whatever gear we had taken off the ship to make more room, and sailed back to the U.S. And I hadn't really planned that I would never go back to the fleet again, but that's how it wound up. So that wound up being my very last carrier landing.
But next was Pax River and Test Pilot School.
Yes, I stayed in VF1 for another 3 or 4 or 5 months. And then the deal had been that I was pulled out of my F-4 Phantom squadron to go make the first cruise with the Tomcat. And that's where Sam Leeds came into play, who I had worked for my time there waiting in the pool to start the F-4 Phantom. So that time paid off big time because he grabbed me out of my F-4 Phantom squadron. The deal was I was going to make the first cruise. They had picked 6 pilots who had made at least one cruise. I had made 1.5 cruises. Went to the first 2 Tomcat squadrons, and then the deal was we were going to come out of the Tomcat squadron and go to the RAG as an instructor. So I spent about 9 months as a RAG instructor trying to get to test pilot school, and I almost didn't get to go there. And the first time I applied, I was passed over. I didn't get selected to go to test pilot school, which is strange. I had fleet experience in 2 different fighters, combat experience, aeronautical engineering degree, and I didn't get picked. And so my air wing commander, Smoke Wilson, who was a test pilot as well, he did some checking and he found out that the Bureau of Personnel had said, if you're in Tomcats now, you ain't getting out of Tomcats. The training is so valuable and so expensive that once you're in Tomcats, you can't get out of them. Well, he called the commandant of the test pilot school, who had been one of his students. Commander Bob Johnson was the commandant of test pilot school, and Smoke Wilson, who was our air wing commander, he was our CAG, Carrier Air Group Commander. Anyway, he called Bob Johnson and told him this situation. Next thing I knew, CAG told me, call Bob Johnson. He wants to talk to you. And so I was, I'm just a lieutenant at that point. I'm a little intimidated. So I called the skipper at test pilot school and I said, sir, I know I'm just Joe Blow off the street, but I really want to be a test pilot. So he said, send me your application directly to me. Mail it directly to me, which, of course, this is going outside of chain of command, obviously. He hopped in his car at Patuxent River and drove up to Washington, D.C., and walked into the Bureau of Personnel and slapped my application on their desk and said, you guys are preventing me from being able to select or to consider somebody like this because of your Tomcat rule. And so they backed off. And so thank you, Bob Johnson, may he rest in peace. He's the reason I got to go to test pilot school. He's the reason I got to become an astronaut. I wanted to be a test pilot, number one. And then along came space shuttles, and I saw those, and I said, oh my gosh, I have got to get me one of those, which is a line out of Independence Day. But I saw space shuttles, and I said, oh man, I had not been interested in flying capsules, but this is an airplane. I'm an airplane guy. I've been an airplane guy all my life. I want to fly those. And so thanks to Bob Johnson, I got to go to test pilot school, and I got to fly space shuttles as well.
Before we get to the space shuttle, there's a stable, all these awesome airplanes you get to fly when you're learning to be a test pilot. I'm asking you to pick one of your favorite shuttles. I know that's not really a great question to ask, but of all those experiences you had, what was the one you look back on and said, I remember, and it made me a better test pilot and obviously a better aviator from there?
Oh, golly, how do I pick one?
I know. Well, you can talk about multiple. That's also a good answer.
Well, one of the airplanes that was a real awakening was the T-38, the T-38 Talon, Air Force trainer, advanced trainer, small wings on it, supersonic jet. The Navy didn't have at the time any supersonic jets that were in pilot training. And so this was kind of exciting to fly those things. It also had a relatively high approach speed. If you were light on fuel, 155 knots was your approach speed if you're light on fuel. And if you're over 1,000 pounds of fuel, so he didn't carry very much fuel in those things. I think 3,800 pounds was total fuel in a T-38. So that was certainly exciting. Of course, I got to spend 18 years with NASA flying those later on. But I also got to fly an airplane that I had built a control line model of when I was a teenager, the OV-1 Mohawk, twin turboprop. We had those at Patuxent River, Army airplane, and it was for asymmetric thrust testing. One of the Air Force instructors that I enjoyed flying with there at test pilot school, he showed me a cool maneuver you could do in the OV-1 Mohawk. You could do a snap roll at the top of a loop. So what you would do is you would build up a bunch of speed, you'd go into a loop, and then at the very top of the loop, you'd go full aft stick and stomp on a rudder and do a 180-degree roll, a snap roll, and then finish the second half of the loop. So he showed me how you could do that in that airplane. But what I really enjoyed the most, it would sort of do a short field takeoff, could have used more horsepower, but it would really do a short field landing. What I really enjoyed at Pax River was slowing it down really slow, so 75 knots, hanging on the power, hanging on those big turboprops, and touch down and immediately slam it into full reverse and turn off right at the hold short. You didn't even have to roll down the runway to the next turnoff. You could turn off right at the hold short if you did that. And so I remember doing that one time, and when I taxied back in to the ramp and shut down, there was one of the test pilot school instructors, and he was in his running gear. And this is a remarkable life coincidence. He was Mike Smith. Mike Smith went on to get selected in the 1980 astronaut class, and sadly he died on his very first space flight, which was the loss of Challenger. But I thought, oh man, he's one of the instructors. Am I in trouble for doing this? And all he said to me was, he said, I just wanted to see who it was doing that. And I don't think that hurt me any. Well, yeah, I'm pretty sure it didn't because they pronounced me outstanding student in my test pilot school class. So that must not have hurt me any.
What was it like applying to be an astronaut? I feel like now there's an application you see, NASA will put out the numbers. There's tens of thousands of people that apply. It's just, anyone, literally anyone can apply. But when you went through, was it I literally know nothing about the way the process works. What was it like to apply?
You had to go through your own military board first. So the Navy convened a selection board. This just involved a paper application. So you sent in your paper application to the Bureau of Personnel. NASA had asked the Navy and the Air Force to give us 90 names, 45 pilot and 45 other than pilot, who would be mission specialists, like a flight engineer sort of thing. The Navy, being well-behaved as we are, we sent 90 names to NASA. The Air Force sent 127 because they said, well, we can't possibly cut it down like that because our guys are so outstanding and so great that we can't trim it down to 90. That was the first hurdle, and then NASA went through all those applications, and they had more than 9,000 total applications, of which they trimmed it down to what they called highly qualified, and they wound up with 1,500 pilots. They interviewed 80 pilots out of that 1,500, and they interviewed 125 mission specialist applicants. And then on January the 16th, 1978, not that I'll ever forget that, they picked 15 pilots and 20 mission specialists. It was an interesting story because when I came back, I left off what the process was with NASA. I mentioned that NASA interviewed 80 pilots and 127 mission specialists. You went down to Houston, Texas, for 6 days. You arrived on a Sunday and you finished on a Friday. And most of the week was physical examinations because they wanted to make sure that you're absolutely physically qualified. But there were other things as well. I got to talk to 2 psychiatrists. One of my fellow test pilots back at Pax River told me, do not try to BS the psychiatrist. And so, man, if they asked me a question, I spilled my guts. I told them everything. And I remember one of the psychiatrists said, you're a lot more honest than most people are. Well, that's because I'd been told, don't try to BS the shrink because he's going to figure you out. And so I didn't want to be figured out. So I didn't try to BS him. And one of them was a guy named Terry McGuire. Gentlemanly, kind of grandfather-looking guy. He wasn't that old, but he smiling, happy, nice guy. The other guy was the mean guy. I don't remember his name. His job was to get you frustrated and see how you handled that. And Terry McGuire he got to be the nice guy, and he asked you questions, tell me about your family, tell me about, your career in the Navy, stuff like that. The real high pressure part was the interview. And the interview was 1 against 8 or 9. So it was this long green table, and the selection board included 3 or 4 astronauts. The chief astronaut, John Young, of course, was there. The director of flight operations, George Abbey, who was the big guru. He was there. There was an equal opportunity, Joe Atkinson. There was scientists involved as well. And it was about an hour and a half interview. They blocked out a 2-hour block. And so you'd spend as much as an hour and a half in there talking to them. And they asked you a bunch of different kinds of questions. One of the questions you got asked was, what do you think about the Panama Canal situation? At the time, this was the fall of 77. We were considering giving the Panama Canal to Panama, where we had built it, we had paid for it, we owned it. And it was to see, how are you going to handle a potentially touchy political question? And could you handle it in a diplomatic way, or did you say, nah, they try to take the thing, we're going to bomb them back to the Stone Age, So how would you handle a political question? But it was kind of tense. Well, it turned out that 80% of your score was the interview. And so I guess I must have done okay. I was the youngest pilot they picked by 3 days. One of the Air Force pilots was 3 days older than I was, but I was the youngest pilot. I had gone back to Patuxent River after my week there in NASA, and the same test pilot that told me, don't try to BS the shrink, said, well, what do you think your chances are? And I said, 0. I looked around at these other 19 test pilots that I was there with that week, and these were guys that had flown in half drill, half donut. These were guys I had read about, heard about, I got back to Pax River and I was almost depressed because I said, they're never going to pick me. They've got all these other guys. Well, it turns out they picked a range of ages. The oldest pilot they picked, I think, was 39. And Dick Scobie, who was in my class as well, who was the commander of Challenger when it went down, he was 38 or 39. So they picked a range of ages. And therefore, you get a range of experience. The guys that were older had more experience than me. And I guess I looked at that and I said, I don't have the experience these guys have got. They're never going to pick me. Well, they did.
Hypotheticals aren't always fair. But a friend of mine, when I told him I was going to have the chance to sit down and talk with you, he asked me to ask you, what would you have done if you hadn't been picked as an astronaut? Do you think you would have that personality that you would have just kept applying? That was the goal. You were absolutely always going to come back to that. And then by the same side of it, I guess a two-part question, a little bit of foreshadowing here. You went on to be chief astronaut. And I'm guessing you sat on the other side of that long green table like John Young did, and you helped interview folks. What did you tell those folks that didn't get picked? I'm guessing probably someone else you probably got to deliver the happy news and tell people they were about to live their dream and be an astronaut. But did you have advice for them to, hey, keep after this, or maybe this isn't your thing? What was kind of that side of it as well?
I did get to talk to the guys that didn't get selected because like I say, the prime guy on the selection board was the director of flight operations. So he was the one that got to call the ones that got selected, but I got to call the guys that didn't get selected. So we kind of divided it up among the pilots of the pilots that we had interviewed. And that was kind of a sad thing. And so, but you got to say, hey, look, you did really well, but we're only picking 12 guys this time, or whatever it was. It was one selection. We only picked 4 pilots. You would tell them, I hope you will apply again because you did very, very well. So my advice to you would be don't give up. Don't give up. Rick Husband, who was the commander of Columbia when we lost Columbia, he didn't get selected until the 4th time that he had applied. And so we valued persistence. And I told them that as well. I said, we really appreciate persistence. And so my advice to you is don't give up. Don't give up. You didn't get to deliver the happy news. But another story was January the 16th, 1978. I got to work a little bit late that morning because one of my fellow test pilots who lived, I don't know, a mile or 2 away from me had asked if I could give him a ride that morning to Pax River. And we lived out in Leonardtown, which was a little ways out of Pax River, Breton Bay. So I had picked him up. And so when I walked into my office, there was this little yellow sticky, not a sticky, but a yellow, you were called by George Abbey. Please call ASAP. And it had his phone number. I think my heart skipped a couple beats right then and there. I still have that yellow note. I made sure I kept that, so I've still got it. And so I called, and Cheryl Bullion, who was like his executive assistant, the one that answered the phone, and I said, this is Hoot Gibson. I was asked to call Mr. Abbey, and she put me through, and I got to him, and he's a master of understatement and all. He started off by saying, well, I was just wondering if you might still be interested in the Space Shuttle. And, what are you going to say then? I probably said, well, but that would be. Are you kidding me? So I said, well, yes, sir, absolutely, I am still interested. And he said, well, okay, all right, if you're still interested and you don't mind, we think we're going to go ahead and pick you. Is that okay? You're going, are you kidding me? So I said, yes, sir. Yes, sir, that'd be okay. So anyway, one of those moments you'll never forget.
Absolutely. I know you were one of the first class of, and I love the term, my wife still thinks it's made up, ASCANs, astronaut candidates. And then after, I think it was about a year of training, that's when you became an astronaut, the silver wings, and then those became gold when you went to space. I had the incredible privilege at VT10 to fly with some of the new class of new ASCANs that came through, and I get to fly with 3 of them in the T6. Actually, one, it was her first flight. No offense to airliners don't count. It was her first flight in an actual airplane in the front seat of a T6, and she did great. It was really, really wonderful. I say that because the training has changed, I think, from when, oh, good Lord, the Mercury 7, the Apollo astronauts, and then obviously the shuttle astronauts. What was it like going through the training syllabus? Obviously, again, you talked about you're a combat aviator. You know your way around airplanes. You're going to get spooled up on the T-38, and I have some T-38 questions later. But what was that process like? And then what was that at the end of that year? Was it a feeling of accomplishment, or was it still a feeling of there's a lot to go?
Well, there was certainly a lot to go. Originally, when we came in, it was going to be a 2-year astronaut candidacy program. And the reason was, they told us that, we had picked some astronauts in the past that after 6 months we wished we hadn't. And so making you an astronaut candidate was going to make it a whole lot easier to get rid of you. But what happened was we got to the end of a year and they said, this is silly. We don't need another year to evaluate you guys. And so at the end of our year, they gave us our silver astronaut pin. And so we were being called astronauts at that point. And of course, you felt a little bit shy about calling yourself an astronaut because I haven't been to space yet. Okay, I've got the silver astronaut pin. And you don't get the gold one until after you fly. And you don't get your Navy astronaut pilot wings until after you fly. And of course, that's all fair. But I guess we did so well that they said we don't need to make it 2 years. So at the end of 1 year, they just pronounced that from now on, you're an astronaut and you get your silver pin.
Approach and landing. Flying formation. I think you flew chase on the approach and landing test, flew chase on, I think it was STS-2 when they came back from orbit. What was it like flying the T-38 next to the orbiter on a 747? I feel like I love formation flying. It's immediate, instant feedback. You know if you're in position, if you're out of position. But you were there to do a job, safety chase, getting photos. I just feel like that had to have been an incredible set of flights. But I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about it.
I wasn't a chase pilot for the approach and landing test. But what happened was for STS-1, well, actually, we had chase pilots up through, for quite a while, up through at least STS-5 and 6, the first flight of Challenger. And turned out that all 4 of the prime chase pilots for STS-1 were Navy. I looked at that job and I said, oh, man, I really want to do that. And so these were some of my buddies who had also flown F-4s and F-14s. And so I said, hey, I want to be a chase pilot. Would you guys let me be a chase pilot? And so it did. I got to be chase 4 for STS-1. So I was at Edwards for the landing. Chase 1 and 2 were down at Cape Canaveral for the launch, just in case there had been a malfunction during launch where they had to do the return to launch site abort, RTLS, return to launch site, to chase them as they came down. So chase 1 and 2 were there at the Cape. I was actually at El Paso because if they had to abort once around, they would come into Northrop Strip in White Sands. And so chase 3 and 4, I was chase 4, were there just in case. And then we immediately deployed to Edwards as soon as we saw they weren't going to abort once around. And so we were there in place until chase 1 and 2 got there. So anyway, for the landing of STS-1, I wasn't anywhere that you could see me because I was chase 4. I was at the low energy approach point in case they had run low, in case the drag coefficient was greater than what we thought it was going to be during entry. So I was there with chase 3, but then for STS-2, I was appointed to be chase 1. So I was the leader of the chase team that year. So I got to oversee the training of the new group of pilots to be able to learn how to catch a space shuttle and how to stay with it and chase it back down to landing. So that was exciting.
I bet it was. What airspeed is the shuttle at when you're actually consummating the rejoin?
That's a great question because we had to catch it at a point where we could stay with it. It wouldn't do you any good to be Wile E. Coyote and try to catch it where it's going too fast and you can't stay with it. Because what we had to do, in order to have enough drag to stay with it, we had to have the T-38 configured with the landing gear down. We could have 40% flaps for more drag, and we had enlarged speed brakes. We called them MSBs, modified speed brakes, 50% larger than a normal T-38 speed brake. And so what we had to do was we had to pick a point where we knew the space shuttle was going to come through to land on lakebed runway 23. And I identified on the sectional chart a lake that was kind of shaped like a mushroom. So we called that mushroom. And so we would hold in a 6-minute pattern, just like we would do coming into the carrier when you went into holding before recovery on the carrier. So we'd fly a 6-minute pattern and timing it so that we would be right at the intercept point as the shuttle got there. And it was interesting because Mission Control would give us a call, and the call was chase, Mission Control, Mach 9. That meant the shuttle was at Mach 9. That means they will be at mushroom 9 minutes from now. They're slowing down by a Mach per minute from Mach 9 on down. And so we could reset our clocks and readjust our pattern. Now, what you had to do, we're holding at 35,000 feet because we wanted to catch them as high as we could possibly catch them. But we weren't dirty yet. We had everything up. We had the gear and the flaps up, and we're cruising at 35,000 feet. As we got to the join up, you would pitch up, get below 280 knots indicated to put the gear down. Once you got the gear coming down, now you can pitch back over and accelerate back up to about 310 knots indicated, because we could go to 320 with the gear down once it was down. But in transition, we had to be below 280. Now, the normal T-38 is 240 for gear extension, but we put F-5 gear doors on the T-38s because they had a flap that minimized the hydraulic loads, so we could drop the gear at 280. And then you'd crank out 40% flaps, and you had the big modified speed brakes. So that's what you had to do to catch the Space Shuttle and then be able to stay with it.
Did you have a lot of energy on either side? Could you really accelerate or decelerate, or once you were together, you were pretty much in position?
Oh, once you got joined up, you were in fine shape. You could pretty much do what you wanted. What I would do, rather than moving the throttles around any, is I would just crack the speed brakes in a little, crack them back out to full deployment. So you could do that. Although you could do the throttles. Now the throttles, you had to be very careful at 35,000 feet because the T-38 little baby J-85 engines were very prone to compressor stall at that altitude. And it wasn't unusual to stall an engine. And in fact, we never really talked about it much. It wasn't totally unheard of to stall both engines. And when you compressor stalled the T-38 engine, it quit. It quit running. And so what you had to do was you had to immediately stopcock that engine because it still was flowing fuel. And if you wet the igniters, you're not going to get a relight. And so we didn't talk about it, but we just might have had a number of dual engine flameouts practicing for the task. We never had any that I'm aware of in the actual join-ups on getting the shuttle, but we might have had a number of them in practice. And all it took was if you got on the rudders at all up at that altitude, you had so little air coming through the engines when you're down at like 280 indicated at 35,000 feet that if you got just a little bit of side slip or you got a little bit of a sudden angle of attack increase, you could go pop both engines. So it took a little bit of practice and learning.
What's the responsibilities of Chase 1? Are you the safety chase? Are you doing photos? What are you focused on when you've joined with the shuttle?
Chase 1, we were to do both of the things you mentioned. So we're a safety chase. We're going to inspect the underside. It was always an astronaut in the back seat. I had Dr. Kathy Sullivan in my back seat in Chase 1, and she got one of the most glorious photos of the Space Shuttle in our join-up as we were moving in to get over on the right wing. But we were going to shoot as many photos as we possibly could of the underside because landing on the lake bed, you would occasionally throw up a little bit of sand, or the tires of the shuttle would throw up a little bit of sand, maybe a rock or two, and damage tiles. And so we wanted to be able to separate out what happened prior to landing and what happened in the course of the landing. And then the other purpose we had was get next to them, match their speed, and give them an altitude and airspeed comparison, because the air data probes on the Space Shuttle are retracted during reentry or else they'd melt, and so they aren't deployed until Mach 5. Once we slow all the way down to Mach 5, we will put the air data probes out. They aren't calibrated above Mach 3.5. I joined up next to Joe Engel and Dick Truly in Columbia on STS-1, and then I called out, 290 knots, 15,300 feet, something to that effect. So it was to give them a comparison to tell them that their data was reading correctly. And then we were going to call out touchdown height. I had drawn some diagrams. What we could do is we could use the length of the landing gear and the tires, which was something like 12 feet. I drew a bunch of cartoons of here's what the shuttle's going to look like at 100 feet. Here's what it's going to look like at 50 feet. This was for STS-1. We had put those all out because what we're calling for them is how high are your wheels above the runway? And so as you got down closer, you'd be calling, 50 feet, 30 feet, 20 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet, touchdown, nose gear, 10 feet, nose gear, 8 feet. So we had all that we were doing.
Your first space flight, you flew as pilot. And I think a lot of times people maybe aren't as familiar with the way that NASA titles the different positions on the orbiter. They would think you were the one flying. Well, the commander is the one flying. You're the pilot in the right seat. But what are the responsibilities of the pilot? Because again, I don't think it's probably as well known that literally every other space flight you flew as commander, you were the boss. But for that first one, you're probably flying with someone who's a little bit more experienced and learning from them.
Oh, absolutely. I flew with Vance Brand, and this was his third space flight, his second shuttle flight. He had been the commander of STS-5, and he had flown Apollo-Soyuz, the Apollo-Soyuz docking way back in 1975. So he was my commander. So, of course, I learned a whole lot about spaceflight and a whole lot about being a commander from Vance. And he was very, very thorough and very, very attention to detail oriented, which is, of course, something we learned right away in aviation. You got to be. So I learned a lot from him. And it was a real experience because in many ways, the more difficult job in the space shuttle is the job of the pilot, the guy in the right seat. And that's because what's over there on his console, his or her console, it was described by some of the mission specialist astronauts when they would have to ride in the right seat now and then for a simulation as a snake pit, because everything that was over there was really important and it was really particular that you do it the right way. And of course, I was of the opinion that the reason that the two pilots on the space shuttle were called the commander and the pilot was because astronauts were such prima donnas, nobody was willing to be called co-pilot. So it was going to be commander and pilot, and it just confuses the daylights out of everybody. I remember after my first flight in the shuttle, which was aboard Challenger, we made the first landing back at Cape Canaveral, and later in the day somebody said to me, "Now you were the pilot of Challenger this morning, right?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "That was a beautiful landing you made," and I said, "Thank you." It was a lot easier just to answer it that way rather than have to go through the whole explanation. But what you had over there on the right side, you had the auxiliary power units, which are the hydraulic power supplies for the shuttle. You also had all the electrical buses. You had the fuel cells, all the fuel cell controls, all the controls of the electric buses. You had control over all the AC and DC that fed the orbiter. And it was rather complex because you had 3 fuel cells that you had to manage. And you had you had 3 main buses, main A, main B, and main C. But then beyond that, you had all these sub-buses as well. You had essential buses. So it was a snake pit over there on the right side. So that was more challenging than what you had as the commander. Now, as the commander, you had all the general purpose computers. We had 5 GPCs, general purpose computers. You had those up in your overhead panel. Over on the left side, what did you have? Well, you had HVAC. You had the heating and air conditioning over on the commander's side. So you were going to manage that. That pretty well ran itself. You had the water loops and you had the Freon loops and things like that, but they weren't anywhere near as demanding or as complicated as what the co-pilot had. You know, one of the other big jobs that you had as the pilot was you're the one that drops the landing gear. And so, funny story, it was Mike Coates who was flying his first mission as pilot. Well, he only flew one time as pilot. He flew as pilot one time and then commander twice. But on his first mission, they had a launch pad aboard. They were the first ones. This was mission 41D, first flight of Discovery. They lit 2 of their main engines, and the computer didn't like what it saw on one of the engines, and it said, "No, this is no good, shut them down." So they shut down on the launch pad. So the joke was that 2 big jobs that the pilot had was bringing up the APUs and getting the hydraulics ready and dropping the landing gear. And so I think it was on their first launch attempt, Mike Coates got all the APUs up and running, and that was time critical. You had to go through the whole process, switch by switch, step by step, to get the hydraulics up into full pressure. And he finished that, and he said, "Okay, I finished that. Want me to go ahead and get the gear now, and I can be all done?" So the joke was those were the only 2 things that the pilot did, was bring up the hydraulics and drop the landing gear.
On that first space flight of yours in Challenger, 2 things that I think are incredible stories. Number 1, photography. I'm a photographer, and your photos, the photos the 2 you took of Bruce McCandless and the MMU are literally legendary. And then flying formation on a lead balloon, or maybe not flying formation on a lead balloon. I was wondering maybe if you could kind of tell those 2 stories.
The issue of shooting the photos of the world's first untethered spacewalk. Bruce McCandless was the one that got to do that. He was the first one. He had worked on that manned maneuvering unit, which was the Buck Rogers jetpack, from day one. And so he had more experience with it, so that was really fitting that he got to do the first untethered spacewalk. There were only 5 of us on the crew. 2 of them are outside. Bob Stewart and Bruce McCandless are outside doing spacewalks. And the commander, Vance Brand, was busy, and he was nervous. Oh, golly, he was so nervous because his 2 baby chicks were out there, and, they could possibly float away. We didn't let them both fly free at the same time. You didn't want to have to track down both of them. And I'll never forget, Bruce flew it initially staying within the cargo bay, just checking it out, making sure everything was working in the right direction. And we were waiting for sunrise because he was going to translate out to 300 feet away, 320 feet away. But they could only translate at about a foot per second, because if you start using speeds greater than a foot per second relative to the shuttle, you're going to start exciting orbital mechanics. And instead of moving closer, if you use too much speed, you're going to go up in altitude. If you decelerate it too much, you're going to drop down in altitude. So they could only use a foot per second. So we were waiting for sunrise. And as soon as we got sunrise, it was, okay, Bruce, you're cleared to translate. So he started moving out. I was the only person on the crew who could work a camera? No, I was the only person on the crew that during this spacewalk I had absolutely nothing to do. Ron McNair was with us, and he was working a laser rangefinder, and so he was keeping track on what their opening speed and closing speed was and that sort of thing, and he was moving the video cameras as well. So I'm parked at the window with a Hasselblad 70 millimeter film camera on which everything is manual. The shutter speed is manual, the f-stop is manual, the focus is manual, and so I'll never forget, I looked through the viewfinder at this image, and I didn't even shoot the picture. I just put the camera down and said, oh my gosh, I do not believe what an image this is. If I don't mess this up, I'm going to get the cover of Aviation Week magazine. And there was something I had to do in addition to setting all of those different settings. I must have taken 3 light meter readings for every frame that I shot, but it paid off. And what I had to do, though, Challenger was oriented at an angle. We were standing on our tail, so our tail was towards the Earth, but we were yawed out of plane about 28 degrees. And the reason for that was to have the best KU band antenna coverage that we could get, because the KU band is what let us send live television down to the ground. So the mission wanted the best KU band coverage. Well, when it came time to take photos, we humans are accustomed to seeing the horizon level. So I had to roll the camera to put the horizon level in all the photos that I shot. Ron McNair shot a couple of photos in between the things he was doing, but he didn't roll the camera. So the astronaut was straight up and down, but the Earth, it made an interesting angle to see in the pictures that Ron shot. But I had to take into account, okay, make sure the horizon is level in all these pictures. Well, I didn't get just one cover of Aviation Week. I actually got 3 covers in the course of the spacewalks.
The lead balloon. I can't let you go without asking about the lead balloon.
The lead balloon didn't work out very well.
Imagine that.
We were doing the very first checkout of the rendezvous software because nobody had to do any rendezvous with it before. And the very next flight after ours was going to be rendezvousing with a broken satellite that they were going to be repairing. So I was 41B, and 41C, when it got up there, it was going to rendezvous on the satellite that wasn't working right, and they were going to replace a gyro or something like that on that satellite. So they were going to need to use the rendezvous software. So we were going to check it out with a Mylar balloon that was to be a 2-meter diameter inflated, but in order to give it some mass, because there is just infinitesimal trace of atmosphere even where we were at 160 nautical miles up, about 185 statute miles up. It needed to have some mass, so it had 200 pounds of lead weights in it. So that's why we called it the lead balloon. And the plan was, we're going to pop this thing out. It was in a canister, and it had a spring that shoved it away from the orbiter, and then we were going to maneuver away from it and then actually re-rendezvous with it and exercise some of the rendezvous software. So the plan was, when it came out, it was going to be folded up and it was going to inflate itself, I want to say like a minute after we had ejected it out of the orbiter, and we watched it and we watched it and we watched it, and nothing happened. And then all of a sudden, after about 4 minutes, it exploded. The lead balloon exploded. And Bob Stewart, who was an Army helicopter pilot, a gunship pilot in Vietnam, he keyed the mic and he said, "Hey, Houston, it just blew up." And half of Mission Control said, "Oh, fantastic, it finally blew up." And the other half of Mission Control said, "Oh, no, it blew up." And so the two sides looked at each other and they said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "Well, I guess I don't know what it means that it blew up." So they called us and they said, "When you said it blew up, what did that mean?" He came back with, "Yeah, Houston, it exploded." And so we didn't get to do any checkout because the aluminized mylar was going to be enough of a radar return for us to be able to use the radar. Well, just the 200 pounds of debris weren't. And so now Mission Control got a little concerned that one orbit from now, we're going to intercept where that 200 pounds is, and we don't want to hit it. So if I remember right, they had us execute a little bit of a burn just to make sure that we wouldn't come back through that point, an orbit later. So that was as far as the lead balloon went. We had been having sort of a rough time on that mission because we launched a satellite the first day, and then Mission Control couldn't find it. It wasn't where it was supposed to be. They called us later on that day and they said, "Hey, when you guys launched that satellite," it was the Westar 6 communication satellite, they said, "Was it wobbling or anything like that when you deployed it? Were there pieces falling off of it or anything? Did it look normal to you?" And I keyed the mic and I said, "Does this mean you can't find it?" And they said, "Yeah, we don't know where it went." We said, "Well, no, it looked just fine when we sent it out." Well, it turned out that its booster motor had failed, and instead of going to a geostationary orbit up 22,000 miles, it wound up in a useless 400-mile orbit above the Earth. And so they delayed 2 days before we deployed Palapa B2, another exactly same kind of satellite, because they concluded that it had been a random failure. And so we launched Palapa B2. It had a random failure as well. Had the same exact thing. So they went back to the motor manufacturer, although we videoed the burn of that one. We didn't video the burn of the first one. We videoed the burn and using the robot arm end effector camera, and we saw what looked like booster motor exploding. It turns out that it had severed its tail cone, its nozzle, so it loses all its thrust when it severs the nozzle. So they went back to the manufacturer and said, "Okay, what did you guys change?" They said, "Well, we didn't change anything. We did it just like, the other ones." And we had launched, the shuttle program had launched several other of those satellites and everything worked fine. And they said the only thing we changed was we changed the parting compound in the mold. They had gone to a silicone type parting compound. Well, silicone is incompatible with carbon fiber layups. And so the nozzle delaminated and separated, and that was what caused it. Now, the happy ending was, I think STS-41G went up later in the year and retrieved both of those satellites and brought them back down to Earth. So we had a rough time with 2 satellites and the lead balloon. The space toilet hadn't failed yet. That happened more like on day 5. But we were on a losing streak on this mission. But then, when the untethered spacewalks launched, wow, we were sailing high.
You mentioned that was also the first time that the orbiter landed back home at KSC. Obviously, you'd flown in the shuttle training aircraft many times, and I'm guessing you'd seen that look pointed right toward the runway at Kennedy. What was it like seeing it for the first time, and I'm going to say in real life, but in your spacesuit in the orbiter? Was it, this training has gotten me ready, or was it kind of that moment of, wow, pinch me, this is not real?
The training really did succeed in getting me ready, and I would have been ready to land it if anything had gone wrong with the commander's control stick or any of that kind of thing. And you felt like, well, I've been here 100 times before. Actually, you had been there probably 500 times before, because generally, before a pilot would fly his or her first mission, you would have had at least 500 approaches in the shuttle training airplane. And before you flew as commander, you would have over 1,000. And so it was just like it looked like in flying the shuttle training airplane. Even the field of view was the same, because it turns out The Space Shuttle has pretty big windows, but they're kind of far away from you, so your angular field of view isn't really that big. And so what we had in the shuttle training airplane, we had big plastic window masking that we put in place, because it turns out the Grumman Gulfstream II, which is what the shuttle training airplanes were, the field of view was too big. And so we had to shrink it down to match exactly what you had on the Space Shuttle. So yes, you had been there 100 times before.
So, okay, we talked about seeing Kennedy in front of you in the daytime, but the next time you were landing a Space Shuttle from the left seat, it was at nighttime. What was the difference? What was it like flying as the commander on that second mission?
We had a policy that I didn't agree with, and that was that only the mission commander is going to touch the control stick when it comes time for us to break out of automatic flight control, which would happen just below the speed of sound. So at about 55,000 feet, when we got to 0.9 Mach number, the commander would take manual control and fly it the rest of the way down. And at the time, John Young, the chief astronaut, was against letting our co-pilots get any stick time at all, because, the attitude was, hey, the one ought to be the one doing all the flying. I disagreed with that. And when I was chief astronaut, I said, I want my pilots getting a little bit of stick time on their way down to landing. And so I changed the policy when I got to be chief astronaut, because when I'm the commander on my very first mission, I haven't had my hand on the control stick during an approach and landing before. And so I have to say, it gives you a little bit of a feeling of unease. It gives you a little bit of I could probably feel a little more confident about this if I had done it previously. Nevertheless, I was trained for it, and it was actually an unplanned night landing. And it was only the second night landing of the shuttle program. We planned to have STS-8 make a night landing, which they did. But then for my flight, we were supposed to land at Cape Canaveral right at daybreak. And I could see, however, that if we couldn't get into the Cape because of weather, any other landing opportunity we had was going to be nighttime. So my pilot and I, Charlie Bolden, who wound up retiring as a major general from the Marine Corps because he went back to the Marines after his 4 flights on the shuttle and wound up being the NASA administrator later on, we had done the majority of our training at night in the shuttle training airplane, because if you can land it at night, you can certainly land it in the daytime. So we were trained and prepared for it, and so it wasn't a non-event, but it was almost a non-event because we had trained so thoroughly for it. And it was easier than a night carrier landing. I'll have to add that in as well. And so I was ready for it. I made a decent landing. It wasn't a perfect landing, but I made a decent landing. And interesting story, my mom and dad weren't able to come to the Cape for that launch, and they weren't able to come to the Cape because we were supposed to land at Cape Canaveral. So they were at home in LA. And I remember looking out the window as we came across Los Angeles, I think at Mach 3. And I said, oh, we're going to boom LA, Mach 3. Mach 3 at 5 in the morning at night over Los Angeles. And so later on, I talked to my mom after the mission, and she said, yeah, I heard you go by. So she heard the sonic boom as we went by to land at Edwards Air Force Base. The landing was uneventful. Charlie was an excellent, excellent co-pilot, and he was coaching me on speeds and altitudes and all of that. And he and I, to this day, are absolutely dear, dear friends.
Okay, so it wasn't just one future administrator of NASA you were flying that day. It was actually 2. So in the, and I'm guessing, was he on the deck up top with y'all, or was he down low? Congressman Nelson, now Administrator Nelson of NASA.
Bill Nelson got put on my crew about 3 months before launch. And so he had a big challenge. And I'll have to tell you, there was some resentment to the politicians coming on board, especially among the mission specialists, because, of course, the attitude by the mission specialists was that all these outsiders that were coming in are taking away a seat that could have been given to one of our mission specialists. Bill had to combat that attitude a little bit when he came on board the crew, but he won us over. And to this day, he has been a dear, dear friend. Of course, he was Congressman Bill Nelson at the time. He was invited, along with Senator Jake Garn, who flew with my wife on her first mission, because they were both the chairpersons of the Space Subcommittee in the Senate for Jake Garn and in the House for Bill Nelson. And, of course, Bill Nelson went on to be Senator Bill Nelson, and then, as you mentioned, he is now NASA Administrator. I predict he's going to be probably the best NASA administrator we've ever had because he's an astronaut. I call him an astronaut. He says, no, I wasn't an astronaut. I was just a payload specialist. Hey, come on. An astronaut is one who flew in space. Bill is an astronaut. So he's an astronaut, but he also knew how to work within the Beltway. He was a politician. He knew how to get things done in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. So I'm very fond of the friendship that all of us, all 7 of us on that crew, have had with Bill Nelson over the years. We have had more crew reunions out of that crew than any other mission I was ever on. And he wound up being a real asset to NASA. He was a help when it came to the Challenger accident. And of course, we were the last mission before the Challenger accident. We landed on January the 18th, 1986, and Challenger was 10 days later, January the 28th, 1986. Bill was a help at getting the Space Shuttle Endeavour to replace Challenger. And I think that was another $1 billion space vehicle, $1.5 billion space vehicle that he and Jake Garn helped NASA get after that tragic accident. So Bill has been a real asset to NASA, and he continues to be to this day.
Before we talk about Challenger and that terrible day, you mentioned your wife. And first off, to anyone listening, please go buy her book. I absolutely loved it. As a fellow Tennessean, man, her story is absolutely an incredible one. I don't think there were a lot of families of astronauts. In fact, I think maybe y'all were the second pair, first pair. I'm sure I'm making a mistake. I think there was a little technicality when I looked, but still, blazing the trail. What was it like being a family? Because clearly you are incredibly busy. She is incredibly busy. Oh, by the way, she's a mom, and that's all the challenges that come with that. What was that like?
Oh, golly, yes. Well, we were the first astronaut couple to marry as astronauts. The first astronaut couple in the U.S. had been Bill Fisher and Anna Fisher. Anna Fisher was selected in our class, my class, 1978. Her husband, Bill Fisher, was selected the next selection, 1980. So they were the first 2 husband and wife astronaut couples in the U.S. There had been a Russian couple. Valentina Tereshkova married one of the cosmonauts. They weren't married for very long. But Ray and I had a real challenge because, yes, both of us were very busy. What we had for the most part was we had day help with the kids. We had our first son about 1.5 years after we married, so we had kids the whole entire time. So once we both started getting assigned to space flights, we took turns. We had a bet, by the way, as to who would be the first one to go to space. I was betting, I'm the youngest pilot. I'm going to be way down the list to get to go to space. Turns out I was the 4th one out of my 15 to get to go to space. But she's one of the first 6 women. We've had boy astronauts for years now. The women are going to fly early and often, is what I figured. So we had a bet as to who was going to fly first. And there was a lot riding on it. It was 50 cents and a jelly donut. And I lost because I went to space first. I went in 84. She went in 85. I went in 86, and then we had Challenger. And then it was almost 3 years later. And then I went in 88, she went in 91, I went in 92, she went in 93, and then I went one more time. I wasn't planning to go after I was selected to be chief astronaut. I figured I'll spend the rest of my career with NASA as the leader of the astronauts. I don't have to fly again. I'm not going to assign myself to a mission. And then NASA made me go do the mirror ducking. So we had some real challenges because every so often one of us would be out of town and then the other one would suddenly say, oh, guess what? I'm going to have to be out of town Thursday night as well. And then it was a crisis, almost a panic. How are we going to handle both of us being gone? We'd have to be able to find somebody to be an overnight babysitter until 1989, which was right after our second child was born, our son Dan. We decided we needed a live-in nanny to come live with us. And we were so lucky. We met Joanne Powell, who was about 10 years older than we were. She was a young widow, and she needed to work a few more years in order to get Social Security qualification. And so she came to work for us, and she stayed with us for 25 years. She made it possible for both of us to be as busy as we were, both of us to be out of town at the same time. Cute story, she had never been anywhere but the states of Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma in her entire life. She came to work for us in 89 and then very soon after that, it was time for Ray to launch on her second mission. We took her to Cape Canaveral with us, so she got to see the Atlantic Ocean. And then after Ray launched, we went back to Houston. And then Ray's landing was scheduled to be in Edwards Air Force Base, California. So I took her with us to California. She got to see the Pacific Ocean. And so all of a sudden, she got to see a whole lot of the United States. And we treasure her. She was just such a lifesaver for us. And I cried when she left. She said she would stay with us until we didn't need her anymore. And I said, we're always going to need you. And after our youngest daughter got to be about 17, 18 years old, she decided that it was time for her to go back, and she moved in with one of her daughters. And I was so sad when she left us. She made it possible, because up until that time, we were living on a ragged edge. Anytime both of us had to be out of town. So that's how we were so lucky to find her. And in fact, she moved from Texas when we left NASA to Tennessee with us, and was with us, well, golly, how many more years was it? It would have been about 8 or 9 years.
What a wonderful gift. I mean, we talk about the unsung heroes of the space program. I mean, she kept you all going. That's so absolutely wonderful. We talked about Challenger earlier and that dark day. You were integral to the process of bringing the Space Shuttle back to flight and that investigation and redesigning of the solid rocket boosters. Again, talking about books, there's another really, really great book with Alan McDonald. I know you worked very closely with him. Highly recommended, incredibly, incredibly detailed. What was it like to work with him, and what was that process like?
I got to know him very well in the redesign effort, and I guess a little bit in the investigation of the Challenger accident. And let's see, what was the name of his book? O-Rings and Lies, or something like that. Lies and O-Rings. And what happened was, I was in debriefing when Challenger happened, because our debriefing from a mission would take about 2 weeks, because you would have an individual debrief with mission control. But then you'd have an individual debrief with the auxiliary power unit guys, the hydraulic power guys, the electrical. So it was literally about a 2-week debriefing that you would do. We were in the midst of debriefing, because right when you got back from a space flight, NASA would say, all right, you've been up there for 8 days. Okay, take a day off. And then we're going to be right back into debriefing. We were in the midst of it 10 days after we landed, on January the 28th, 1986. And I remember somebody stuck their head in the door. We were in the big conference room in our building, in the astronaut building, Building 4. Said, hey, they're inside of 5 minutes and counting. You want to take a break and watch the launch, and then we'll come back and resume the debriefing? We said, sure, let's do that. So we took a break, and we watched it happen. And as you can imagine, we never went back into the debriefing. Our whole world got turned absolutely upside down. I had lost friends in aviation prior to that, but never 7 at once. Never had I lost 7 friends at one moment. I remember Ray and I think we went and got in a T-38 the day after Challenger, just to get our minds off of it. When we got back to Ellington Air Force Base, the deputy chief of the astronaut corps, Paul Weitz, tracked me down and said, hey, pack your bags and go to Cape Canaveral tomorrow and take a bunch of clothes with you. I don't know how long you're going to be there, and I don't know what you're going to be doing, but go report to, I think it was George Hamilton, Director of Shuttle Processing, and he'll assign you to a place to work. So I took a bunch of clothes and headed out, and got down there, and I got assigned to work on, or I think I asked to work on 2 of the different teams. One of them was the solid rocket motors, and the other one was the external tank. We were tasked at Cape Canaveral, the guys down at the launch center, we had to answer a question, and that question was, okay, did the right-hand booster rocket of Challenger fail because we assembled it incorrectly, or did we assemble it correctly, and so therefore it's an inherent weakness in the system? Well, that took several months, and there was literally a pile of paperwork just on the booster rockets, about 5 feet tall. And so we had to go through every step of the assembly of the booster rockets. And then I was also working at the same time on the test and checkout of the external tank as well. And so I learned so much about stacking of the booster rockets because we were thinking, when we put those things together, and of course there are 4 segments that get assembled at the Cape. Each of those segments weighs 300,000 pounds. So a booster rocket, when it's all assembled, is 1.2 million pounds of weight each and 12 feet diameter. Assembling those things and not cutting an O-ring, so we had to address, okay, could we have possibly cut an O-ring or not? It took several months to do that. And the assessment was that, yeah, we did assemble it correctly. So it was an artifact, or it was an effect of the absolutely cold weather and the fact that we had never qualified the booster rockets below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And on the day of launch, it had come all the way up to, I forget what the temperature was, in the 40s, but it had been down to 28 degrees overnight. We had never tested it for that. And what had happened was we got blindsided by our success, where the attitude was, well, look, we've been successful 24 times leading up to now. We will be successful this time as well. Well, that's the wrong attitude, obviously. And so the Challenger crew, paid very dearly for that. So having learned all this about the booster rockets, when we finished that job, they assigned me to be the lead astronaut on the redesign effort for the booster rocket. So I spent a bunch of time down in Huntsville at Marshall Space Flight Center, which was the responsible NASA organization for the propulsion and for the booster rockets, therefore. And I spent a bunch of time out in Utah with Alan McDonald and the whole team out there, Carver Kennedy, all of that team, working on redesigning the booster rockets. I was useful in that job because there were 2 concepts they were looking at. One of them I didn't like at all. It was an open air joint. The philosophy was when the motor pressurized, it goes to 1,000 psi. Well, that will put a column of air over there against the O-rings, and that static column of air there will prevent anything happening to that O-ring, as long as the O-ring holds. I was dead set against that, and I let them know that the astronauts, I made a little speech that said, we know that when we climb into that orbiter, we're sitting on a bomb. But if we go with open joints in those booster rockets, I am really going to feel like I'm sitting on a bomb, and I'm not going to like it a bit. And so they dropped that. And so we went with the sealed joint. And I want to say Morton Thiokol Incorporated did just a brilliant job on the redesign of those booster rockets. They put in place it was called a pressure-actuated flap. It was like an expansion joint in the booster rocket that would help pressurize the seal between the 2 booster rockets. And that saved our bacon on a flight later on in 1996, it was, that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, had helped us. They told us we couldn't use this cleaner anymore because the snail darters and the spotted owls didn't like this cleaner. And so they wouldn't let us use that cleaner anymore. And when we would assemble the segments of the booster rocket, we glued the insulation together between the segments. Well, this new cleaner wasn't worth a darn, but the snail darters liked it, and so did the spotted owls. But it didn't work. And so the glue didn't hold, and we got a bunch of soot in the joints. That's the only time that ever happened. What saved our bacon was this pressure-actuated flap. The pressure would get in this flap, and it would push the flap tightly against the other segment. And that's what saved the day, or we would have burned through all the joints in those 2 booster rockets. And so they did just an absolutely brilliant job. We had just about no problems from then on with the solid rocket boosters.
Okay, so we talk about things in the military, things I guess even a space flight you can't talk about. Your next space flight, the payload is the thing we can't talk about. But there was a little bit of I'm not going to say drama. You almost died, literally, because of a failure, and it wasn't necessarily just the orbiter itself. There was maybe a little bit of a communications aspect to it as well. Trusting the man in the field, the man in the arena, and communicating information back and forth. So I think that story is a really incisive one. I frankly learned a lot from hearing it. Maybe hoping maybe get hear it again.
I have told that story a great many times, and it's a real lesson in communication. This was a top secret classified mission. We were carrying, I'm allowed to say now, after, this was 1988 when we flew the thing. I'm still not allowed to say what it was we carried, except that I can say it was a major new intelligence satellite. We used the robot arm to deploy it. It had an initial problem. We had to do an unplanned re-rendezvous with it and help fix the problem that it had, which we did, and then we separated away and it went on to a completely successful career. Well, we had deployed it on day one, and we had a really long day because we held on the launch pad because the winds up at altitude were out of limits, and the winds up at altitude look like 140 knot wind shear to us when we're blasting up through them. And so 2 days before, we had scrubbed because the winds never came down. Well, we finally got to launch on that day, and the day after launch, well, since we had such a long day, the rule had been that we weren't allowed to have more than an 18-hour day. And so the deployment of the satellite was going to have to wait till the next day. When we got a ways up there, I checked with the crew and I asked them, how you feeling? Are you tired? Because I'd like to press on and get this satellite launched on day one. And so I called Mission Control, and I kind of remember what I told them. I said, hey, the boys are on a roll. We are not tired. We are not sleepy. We want to complete day one, which, that was, we had to be careful in what we transmitted, even though it was encrypted and covered and all of that kind of thing. And what that meant was we want to deploy the satellite on day one. So we did. Well, the next morning, Mission Control called us and they said, hey guys, when we're looking at the launch footage, we saw something hit your right wing. We want you to take the robot arm and take a look at your right wing and tell us what you see. And so I'll never forget, Mike Mullane was my lead arm operator. He maneuvered the arm over, and we took a look at the underside of the right wing with the end effector camera. And I said to myself, when we saw what we were looking at, I said to myself, we are going to die. Because I could see that we had many, many damaged tiles. I couldn't tell how many, but it turned out we had 707 damaged tiles on the right wing, the chine, the wing itself, the landing gear door on the right wing. And I keyed the mic and I said, wow, we are seeing a lot of damage on the right wing. Well, Department of Defense didn't want any television at all coming down, just in case we would show something classified. They finally gave in to NASA Safety, who was adamant, and they said they'd let us send down encrypted TV. Well, encrypted TV, it shoots a frame, it takes about 3 seconds to encrypt it, and then another frame in 3 seconds. So the resolution down on the ground was apparently so bad that Mission Control looked at it and they said, Hoot's all screwed up. He doesn't know what he's talking about. That's not tile damage. That's just lights and shadows that he's seeing. Well, they're forgetting something. They're forgetting that I'm not looking at encrypted data. I'm looking at clear data. Did they ever tell us that? No. What happened was they went away to look at it for quite a while. And I want to say it was the next day when they came back and they said, okay, hey, we've got the word on your right wing. And I said, go ahead. And he said, it's no problem. Just re-enter like always. And I was incredulous. I said, and I keyed the mic, and it was Dave Hilmers was the Capcom, capsule communicator. And I keyed the mic, and I said, Dave, what are they basing that on? And he said, okay, stand by, because he's got to go get that specific answer from engineering. He came back probably about an hour later, and he said, well, they've looked at it, and it's no worse than what we've seen on prior missions. And I was double incredulous now. And I keyed the mic, and I said, well, golly. I said, Dave, I've been here since before STS-1, and I've never seen anything like this before. And then I gave in. And I said, okay, you guys are the experts, but I didn't believe them. And I shouldn't have backed down, but it was considered bad form for an astronaut to argue with Mission Control. And I guess it really wouldn't have been arguing, it would have been drawing them out a little bit, because they never ever said, we don't think you're seeing tile damage. We think you're just seeing lighting effects. Had they said that, I would have said, okay, well, you are screwed up. I'm going to send you clear video. But they never said that. They just said what I just said. They just said, well, it's no worse than what we've seen before. And so I backed down, and I shouldn't have backed down. I should have continued to talk, because it wouldn't necessarily be arguing. It would be, hey, well, come on, I want to talk about this some more. I do talks on crew resource management, and I do talks on communication that involves communication. And one of the things I say is, tell what you're thinking. I was telling what I was thinking. I said, we're seeing a lot of tile damage. They were not telling me. They were not communicating. Mission Control was not communicating. And so the night before re-entry, I remember we had put Mission Control to bed for the night. We were getting ready to go to sleep. one of my crew members said something, told me that he was really concerned about this. And I said something whimsical along the lines of, come on, enjoy the rest of the mission. There's no sense dying all tensed up. I actually have a patch. Somebody made a patch that says that on it. There's no use dying all tensed up. And it has my signature on the patch as well. But all the way down on re-entry, I knew what would happen if we started to burn through on the right wing. The drag would go up on the right wing. And in order to match the drag, the auto flight system would put the left elevon down, because that doesn't really create lift, it just creates drag. So I would see a split in the elevons. And I knew if I saw that happening, it would tell me that we were burning through. And I knew that might give me 60 seconds to tell Mission Control what I thought of them. And fortunately, we never saw it happen. All the way down, about every 2 minutes, I'd say, guys, the elevons look good. We landed, and when people looked at our right wing, they said, holy smokes, I can't believe this. Like I say, 707 damaged tiles. We had one tile that was entirely gone. And I don't know if that happened during the reentry or if it was damaged enough that it came loose during the reentry or if it was gone during launch. No way to know that. But we didn't quite burn through at that point. It turns out that there was a thick metal plate there that I think had something to do with the L-band antenna that was right there. It burned through the thick metal plate, and then it started to work on the orbiter's aluminum skin. But at that point, we were apparently slow enough that we were out of the real heating region. And so we didn't quite burn through on the right wing. So we really dodged a bullet. And at some point, somebody said to me, holy smokes, why didn't you tell us about this? And I said, I did tell you. Why didn't you listen? And in our debrief with flight control, with the lead flight director, I guess the entry flight director, I don't know if I'm just rubbing salt in the wounds or what, but I said, okay, all right, if you guys had listened to us and you had believed us, what do you think we could possibly do? And he said, I don't know. And that's as far as it went. Now, it turned out the problem was there's an ablative coating on the nose cap of the booster rockets, of the solid rocket boosters. And on our launch, we were going to 57 degrees north, so it was a high energy launch. That ablative coating disintegrated and showered the right wing. So what NASA had done was they went to a stronger ablative. They went to one that had a greater shear strength. And so, okay, problem solved. We didn't do anything about, okay, if we do get tile damage in the future, what are we going to do about it? And the situation that we had with Columbia, it wasn't tile damage. The conclusion was it was a hole in the leading edge. And I don't know that whatever we would have put in place to repair tiles would have fixed that. So maybe it wasn't a factor, but we hadn't done anything other than go to a stronger ablative on the nose caps of the booster rockets. So I use this as an example all the time of poor communication. Where I failed was not dragging them out a little bit further.
When you went on to, and I'm going to skip a space shuttle flight here, and we'll get back to it hopefully. But when you went on to be chief astronaut in that leadership position, when you picked commanders and pilots and those folks that were going to be in the leadership positions in space, was that weighing on your mind that hey, you have to be the best advocate for yourself because you were, and in that situation, the ground didn't help you out, but you survived, by the grace of God, whatever you want to say, your skill, all that, it worked, but how do you measure that in someone else? How do you measure that in an aviator that they're going to push back when they have to and maybe not worry about the career repercussions or the thought of being, they're just being a whiny astronaut and really focusing on safety? How did you adopt that when you were in that leadership role as the head of the Astronaut Office?
I remember what a thrill that was when the Director of Flight Operations, Dave Leesma, I suspect he called me to his office and he said, okay, you are now the chief astronaut. And I remember saying to myself, oh my gosh, what a terrific honor. This is just really fantastic. This is really fabulous. And then immediately after that, I said, oh, heck, I don't think I'm smart enough to be the chief astronaut. I don't have all the answers. I mean, look at who I have. I had about 30 to 35 test pilots who were my shuttle pilots. I had probably 25 PhDs, master's degrees were a dime a dozen. I had a whole bunch of engineers and scientists that were my crews, and I said, I don't have all the answers. I don't know that I'm smart enough to be the chief astronaut. And I said, okay, I'm going to need them to help me. And when somebody comes to me with a problem and says, what should we do? First thing I'd say is, okay, what do you recommend? And I would have meetings with my branch chiefs, and I'd say, guys, what are we going to do about this? and I'd get all their inputs. I'm going to make the decision, but I want to hear from everybody. And I got favorable reviews for that. I remember one of the astronauts said something along those lines. I would listen to all the inputs and then I would make the decision. And that was a thing that I learned, or I think I already knew it. But anyway, that was something that I employed when I was chief astronaut, because again, I'm not the one that has all the answers. I got an awful lot of smart people. I never had any doubts about any of my astronauts for the most part. I did have a couple of astronauts that I had to counsel a little bit. In fact, I had one that I said, you are not usable to me now as an astronaut, and here's why. And I want you to fix this. And I want you to be able to fix it because I want you to be completely successful. If you can't fix it, I'm going to send you back to whichever military it was he had come from. And I said, and that's not what I want. I want you to be totally successful. So I wasn't one to where I was going to fire astronauts. I'm going to rehabilitate my astronauts. I'll have to say, though, that among my pilot astronauts, I never had any problems at all with those guys. This was a mission specialist, and he was just a little bit too much of a loose cannon. Now, I think he did fix it, and so he went on to fly a couple more times. But I had all the confidence in the world in my astronauts. And so the big thing that I would do when I was putting together a crew, assembling a crew, I would look at, okay, what did this person do before? What does this mission or that mission have coming up? And so who's going to be the best fit to be commander on that? Pilots, you could pretty well slide a pilot in anywhere. But yeah, commander, you'd spend quite a bit of time. And a lot of it as well was personalities. I don't think I want to put this person with this commander, for example. With the mission specialist, what is the flight doing? What are they doing? And what PhDs do I have that I can put on that mission? So I put a lot of time in on crews, and I would write them in pencil, because that way I can erase it and I can change it real easily. We're assigning crews a year ahead of time. And so I'm working on crews that are 2 years down the road. And so it was a big effort, and I put a lot of time in on it, and I think it paid off. I think we had good crews that worked together well, and I don't think we had many at all personality problems on missions.
Flash forward and flash back here. So I flashed forward, head of the Astronaut Office, but I'm going to flash back just a little bit. In Mike Mullane's book, one of the things he talked about was there's not just, people think of an astronaut when you're in space. You think of on orbit doing that job, but you might be a CAPCOM when you're on the ground. You're going to be training for your next mission. One of the things you're going to do is escort the families and help out the families who are getting to see their loved ones go up in space. And he talked about that you were so good at it. You just had that natural... I don't know if this is the tendency, but you thought about others. You cared very much about these families good Lord, it's a stressful thing to see someone go up in space and come back. Literally they've been working their lives to do this. And you had that way with them and helping them out and helping them through that experience and making it fun and memorable and wonderful. Do you have any good stories, any good remembrances from that? Just what was it like helping those folks out? And then obviously they would be helping your family out when the two of you flew in space.
That was a sacred assignment to be a family escort. And we would assign 2 astronauts to look after the wives and children, the immediate families of the astronauts. And like you mentioned, it is stressful on them. They're sitting there watching their loved ones riding a bomb going into space. And if it all works properly, it's propulsion. If it doesn't work right, it's a bomb. And it is stressful. And it's stressful all the way through, all the way until touchdown and until you get to hug them at the end of the mission. And so you are there to try to smooth any little ripple that you possibly can. And I got to do it, 2 or 3 times. And like I say, to me, that was a very sacred assignment, to do your darndest to help prop them up, to help hold them, because this is challenging. And I remember one of the missions that I was working, they had a scrub, and the wife just broke down and cried right there when they scrubbed. Obviously it wasn't a tragedy or anything, but you're so keyed up, you're so apprehensive, and then all of a sudden it changes, and she just cried. It is a real sacred duty, and hopefully you're not going to have to do it, but obviously there have been a couple of our family escorts that all of a sudden they're escorting a gang of widows. And so there is a lot at stake. There's a whole lot for a family escort to do to make life as bearable as you possibly can for those families.
I'm going to skip a mission, but I'm going to get to Mir because, good Lord, what an honor to be the first person to dock with the Russian space station. And I think now we think of one thing I really, really value about my time in the Navy is I've had the chance to travel. And it's not been that much, but you think of all these places in the world and all these people almost as caricatures. And then when you get to actually travel there and meet them, you realize they're people just like you, and they have families and they have things that they love and they care about. What was it like going to Star City? What was it like working with the Russians? What was it like docking with Mir?
Well, I fought that assignment of putting me as the commander of the first Mir docking. And it goes back to when I was first selected to be chief astronaut, right after I got interviewed by Space News. And I remember one of the questions was, hey, well, the docking with the Mir space station is going to be coming down the road. Are you going to assign yourself to that mission? And I launched off into my speech and I said, I am not going to assign myself to that mission. That is not the job of a leader, to skim off the good deals for yourself. The job of a leader is to take good care of your boys and girls. And that's something that we learn in the Navy. You are to take care of your sailors and look after their well-being and not look out for yourself. So I had gone on record as saying, I will not assign myself to do the Mir docking. Well, fast forward now 2 years later, it's time to assign that crew. I had put together a really sharp crew because it needed to be. I mean, this is a real challenge. And it's the first docking that a space shuttle ever attempted. So I sent my list to my boss, the Director of Flight Operations, Dave Leesma. I don't remember what, a week later or so, something like that. He called me and he said, Hoot, they like your Mir docking crew. And I said, oh, okay, great. And he said, with one exception. And the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I was annoyed instantly, probably more than annoyed, but I don't want to use that expression because I was dumbfounded. Not one of my crews had been messed with my whole 2 years as chief astronaut. Not one of them had been messed with because who knows them better than me? Nobody. And so I think I didn't know what to say. And he said, they want you to command it. And he said, what's your reaction to that? I said, Dave, I don't want to do that. For 2 years now, I have been telling people I am not going to assign myself to the Mir docking flight. And I'm going to give away a name here. I said, Steve will do a fine job on that. I want him to be the commander. And he said, okay, I'll go back up the chain again. I had shown my hand because when the Russians had come to Houston to train, I didn't have a crew assigned yet. But I called the F-4 over to my office. And usually when you got called to the chief's office and it was 4 or 5 people, it was to assign a crew. So they got there and I said, okay, I don't have anything I can tell you, but the Russians are going to be in town for the next week training. And it would be good if the 5 of you get to know them. So, if you can get away for some of their training events and stuff, it would be good to get to meet them. Well, it's obvious what I'm up to here, even though I can't tell them. So anyway, Dave Leesma says, okay, he'll go back up the chain of command again. He calls me up about another week later and he said, Hoot. And I said, yes, sir. They still want you to command it. And I said, Dave, I still don't want to command it. And he said, okay, I'll try one more time. And I think it was about a day later or 2 days later, he called me up and he said, Hoot, do me a favor. And I said, sure, Dave, anything. He said, shut up and go do the Mir docking. And I said, okay, all right, Dave, I give. I'll do it on one condition. And he said, sure, what's that? And I said, if you will come over here and make the announcement to my astronauts and tell them why this is happening, because I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to give myself the best mission that came along in the last 18 years. And so, anyway, that's how it happened. Now, having said that, what a thrill that was. What an incredible experience that was to go see Russia and get to go to Star City, and we got to go to Monino, which is their equivalent of our Air and Space Museum, except it's all these historic airplanes parked out on the grass enduring the Russian winters. Their World War I airplanes are in a hangar, and their fragile things are in hangars, I guess, but oh golly, all of their stuff is sitting outside in the sun in the summertime and in the Russian winters. But it was a real thrill to get to actually see how Russia is and how it really was. This was, we went over to train in September of 1994. And then we went back again in March of 1995. And as an interesting testimonial to their economy, in September of 94, when we went over there, it was 2,500 rubles to the dollar. And back in the 80s and so on, it had been 1 ruble to the dollar. When we went back 6 months later, in March of 1995, it was 5,000 rubles to the dollar. Inflation had doubled. So the Russian economy in 1994-95 was really crummy. And I'm going to say this, but it was true. They were a third world country. We stayed the first time we went over there in the best hotel, the Penta Hotel, which had been built to house everybody for the 1980 Olympics. It was managed by the Germans, and it was a very fine hotel, but you couldn't drink the water. You had to use only bottled water. So Russia was a third world country. Their roads were miserable. They were full of potholes. Their sidewalks were cracking and falling apart. And it was a real experience to see it. And I'm forever grateful I got to do it. So I guess I shouldn't have fought getting assigned to the Mir docking. It was really a thrill that I got to do it. My crew and I had to learn to speak some Russian, and that was an effort. But we had an instructor who had been employed at the DLI, Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, and they had done a cutback in the number of Russian speakers that they had. I don't know why, because we needed more. I guess they had a budget cut or something. So we had Tatiana, who had grown up in Moscow. She was not the least bit impressed that we were astronauts or that we were going to be doing the first Mir docking. She wanted us to know how to speak Russian. And I remember she'd rattle off something at me across the table, and I didn't have a clue what she said to me. And she'd say, well, and I would say, moya samaya lubimaya muchitelnitsa. And it was a play on words. Moya samaya lubimaya is my most favorite. Muchitelnitsa is a play on words because an uchitelnitsa is a teacher. But if you put an M in front of it and it's muchitelnitsa, then it's torturer. So I was saying, my most favorite torturer. And she'd say, ni muchitelnitsa, uchitelnitsa, not torturer, teacher. Because the Russians couldn't afford English teachers or English textbooks. So we had to learn to speak some Russian, because I launched with Anatoly and Nikolai on board Atlantis with me. And we needed to be able to talk to them. Fortunately, Charlie Precourt, my co-pilot, he was gifted at languages. And so he picked up Russian very rapidly. I can carry on a very poor conversation to this day in Russian, a very poor one, but I can still speak Russian a little bit.
I know there was a lot made in the press of Mir and of the condition that the space station was in. You were there. You actually got to open the hatch and go tour the space station itself. What did you think of it? And obviously, I'm guessing the lessons that you all learned and we learned from the Russians went on to influence our International Space Station today.
Yes, they had learned a lot about operating over a long period of time in space and the things that, that you had to apply and do. I had mixed feelings about the Mir space station, and those were confirmed when I got there, too. It occurred to me when we were there that, we're hanging it out a little bit, spending time on board this space station, because it wasn't the quality that we put up there when we put something in space. Some of this stuff had been band-aided together, and so it wasn't real impressive. And I'll never forget when I pulled the hatch open, the first whiff of air that I got was absolutely the most harsh mildew I think that I have ever smelled in my entire life. And I guess in defense of the Mir space station, the module that we docked with was a module they really didn't have a use for unless you were docking a space shuttle to it. And so what did they do? They put all their stuff they weren't using and all their things that they didn't really need in there. And if you've got oxygen and you've got moisture, you're going to have corrosion and you're going to have mildew. And so another thing that I witnessed on the interior of the Russian space station was aluminum oxide. I could see a whole bunch of places where there was oxidation of the aluminum on the inside of it because they just weren't being cautious with protecting it against that. And so I walked around with a camera, and of course we could go anywhere we wanted in the Mir space station because we had trained on it. They could go anywhere in the shuttle. We had taught each other which doors not to open, of course, or which windows not to open. I went over with a camera one time and I took pictures of corrosion on the inside of this aluminum spacecraft and also pictures of dust bunnies the size of a grapefruit. And it was just because their atmosphere recirculation nowhere near as effective as what we employ. And these dust bunnies would collect in a corner where there wasn't much ventilation. That also contributed to mildew. And so I wasn't real impressed with the Mir space station. It operated, sure, and it operated for years, and they made it work. And, that was something that we had to do in the Navy. We had to make it work. But I wasn't that impressed with its technical construction or its systems.
Well, this is a great follow-up question then. What's something that we could take away from the Russian attitude towards space flight? Because they've been doing it, I was about to say as long as we have, one could argue a little bit longer than we have, at least on the man side. But what's something that we could learn from them and use to better NASA and better the way that we fly in space?
Well, you're right, they had been operating space stations way back since the Salyut stations and all, so, for a long, long time. And their philosophy, though, was something that I'm sure you've heard before is, better is the mortal enemy of good enough. And so they would put something up that worked, and it worked, it kind of worked good enough. Maybe not really, but it worked. And so, let's not improve it. If we try to improve it, there's always three outcomes if you change something, and only one of them was worthwhile. They'd put something up and they'd say, okay, this is good enough. Well, one of the funny things, and you'd look at this and you'd go, really? They had problems with attitude control and roll of the Mir space station. And so what did they do? They built a tower, a girder-type structure, and they put a little thruster package up on top of it. And so they could fire thrusters to help roll the Mir space station. I don't think we ever in our right mind would have considered doing something like that. Now, their attitude control was primarily momentum wheels. A momentum wheel is basically a big flywheel. And if you spin it up, then you put a torque on the vehicle as well. Or if you decelerate it, you put a torque on the vehicle. So that's how you could control attitude with a momentum wheel. And then they had some thrusters because every so often they'd have to reboost. But thrusters are expensive, and all the fuel for those has got to be brought up from the ground. So the more you use those, the less you've got left over. They were challenged on electrical power as well, because I went over there one time with the IMAX camera to film over on the Russian space station. And I remember Anatoly, who flew up with me, he's now the commander he was then the commander of the Mir space station. So we did the only ever Russian crew changeout with an American spacecraft. So Anatoly and Nikolai rode up with us to take over the station. And the three who had been up there for 4 months, they're now shuttle crew members. And I wanted to film, and I was going to turn on some extra bright lights. And Anatoly said, no, not now. We're in the dark. We need to wait until we get in the sunlight so that our solar cells can pick up enough electricity, because I'm nervous about how much electrical power you're going to use. So they were doing things on a shoestring with the Mir space station. And all of their atmosphere, they'd get low on oxygen, and they'd burn these candles that produce oxygen. And of course, as you know, they had a fire when one of those things caught fire. Well, I think it was Jerry Lininger was up there as the American astronaut on board. And so they were doing things on a real shoestring. In some cases, we learned what not to do from the Mir space station.
Up with 7, down with 8, so kind of a neat record. But also, when they called wheel stop on that mission, that was unless I'm missing something, that was the last time you flew the orbiter, last time you flew in space. Was that something tough to put behind you? I feel like you have worked, your family, good Lord, all the people around you've worked so hard. An incredible career flying the orbiter, but then I'm pretty sure you knew that was the flight. What's that feeling like?
Well, as we talked about, I had not planned on doing that flight at all. I had a very successful 4th mission, although it wasn't as exciting as any of the other missions. It was a life sciences and materials sciences joint mission with the Japanese, and it was challenging. It was exciting, but it wasn't as exciting as satellite deploys and docking with a Russian space station and the like, or the first untethered spacewalk or anything like that. And so I had what may be the best landing ever made on my 4th mission. The officially recorded sink rate at touchdown was 0.0 feet per second sink rate. It was 204.6 knots, where my target speed was 205 knots. And so it was a picture-perfect landing. And I could walk away from being an astronaut with a landing like that behind me. That was a great success as well. So I wasn't planning on doing the Mir docking. And Ray Seddon, my wife, had hung around with me because she was ready to go back to Murfreesboro, Tennessee, which is where we're sitting right now. She had been ready to move back to her hometown after my fourth mission, after her third mission. She was ready to go back, but in the meantime, I had been selected to be chief astronaut after my fourth mission. You're not going to walk away from a job like that. That is such a privilege and such an honor that I wasn't going to walk away from that. So she stayed. She agreed to stay. We flew her final mission, her third launch in 93. And then she would have been ready to move back to Tennessee, but then I got tapped to do the mirror docking. So she stayed an extra year for me because I had to go do the mirror docking. I suppose I could have said, no, we're leaving, goodbye, but that wouldn't have been my style either. And so when we did land after the mirror docking, in a way she put her foot down and said, okay, we did everything that you wanted to do and that we wanted to do. Aren't we getting about ready to go back to Tennessee? And so at that point, I gave in, even though the chief astronaut who I helped pick to replace me, Bob Cabana, who's now a deputy administrator at NASA, he said, I don't know what you're planning on from here, but yes, you will get to fly some more if you want to fly some more. I must have done acceptably because they were willing to give me another flight, but it just wasn't in the cards at that point. So we made plans, we put things together to go ahead and retire from NASA and move back to Tennessee.
That's awesome. And we're glad to have you here in Tennessee for sure. One thing before I step away from the time at NASA, I know you love guitars. Obviously, Max Q, the band, is a good Lord. We could probably talk for hours about that if we wanted to. Did you ever play a guitar in space, maybe on Mir?
Well, I'm trying to remember. I asked NASA, hey, I'd like to take a guitar to the Russian space station because I know they have an old beat up piece of junk guitar up there on the space station. And I'd like to take them a nice new Gibson guitar. And NASA said, no, you can't do that because guitars are made of wood and that's flammable. And you wanted to say, oh, come on now. When I'm sitting on the launch pad, I'm sitting on 4.5 million gallons of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, but you're telling me I can't have a 6-pound guitar on board? I wanted to say that, but it's not been my style to get in arguments. I don't remember now. I might have just picked it up for a second and played a chord or two on it. It was an old, dilapidated, beat-up guitar. And the movie that I needed to film on the IMAX camera is in the movie Mission to Mir, which is an IMAX movie, and it's Gennady Strikalov playing Moscow Nights and singing Moscow Nights. And my crew is taking part in it. I don't think they even knew the lyrics. Well, I know they didn't know the words to the song. I don't think they even knew what the music was, and they're pretending to be singing along with it. And it's really a gorgeous scene in that movie, and I was proud of it. I was in very few of the scenes because I was one of the two operators for the camera. Myself and Ellen Baker were the two trained to operate the IMAX camera. And so they pretended like they were singing Moscow Nights. So Gennady was strumming the guitar and playing the chords while they were singing it. But I'm not sure that I played the guitar. But like I say, I wanted to take them a guitar. NASA wouldn't let me do it, so I took them a new set of Gibson guitar strings is what I did take up there. And I may have said to them in the ceremony where I presented them some of these presents that NASA wouldn't let me bring them a new guitar, but I brought you the next best thing. I brought you some Gibson guitar strings.
Again, I lied. I have one more NASA question before we get to air racing and models and literally everything else you've got going on. Hoot's Law. Could you tell me what Hoot's Law is? And maybe I think there's a story behind it as well.
Hoot's Law is no matter how bad things are, you can always make them worse. I tell that story when I do my safety stand-downs briefings and my crew resource management things. And one of the ways that you can make things worse is by rushing. That really rings true with aviation because, we get in a hurry to do something and we'll flip the wrong switch. And I did it. I killed my whole crew on my second mission training in the simulator by grabbing a hold of the wrong switch and executing it. What I had done was we got to 2 minutes after launch in the simulator, and it's time for the booster rockets to separate. Well, the training team had failed the automatic separation. So they're not going to separate. So we got what's called a separation inhibit. It's called SEP-INH, SEP inhibit. Well, quick as a flash, that means the auto system isn't going to separate the booster rockets. Quick as a flash, I reach down, grab the switch, flip it from auto into manual, and hit the separate push button. Only I had grabbed the wrong switch. I had grabbed the external tank switch. And so the computer says, okay, you want off the external tank, I'll give you off the external tank because you've commanded it. So it shut the engines down and separated us off, and we're going into the Atlantic Ocean. That's the only place we can go at that point. And that's not survivable. And I said, holy smokes, I'm not as great as I think I am. I'm not as hot as I think. And when you get right down to it, humans make mistakes and humans can fail. And so you need every little bit of backup that you can possibly get. And so that was one of my classic examples of myself doing it and saying, it might be bad right now. We're carrying 166,000 pounds of dead weight in the booster rockets, which are out of fuel, but I sure made it worse. And I remember one day we were training, Charlie Bolden tells this story. I don't purely remember it. He says that one day we were training and we had a problem with one of our essential buses. And so he was needing to isolate that essential bus, and he isolated the wrong essential bus, and that killed an engine. And now we're into an abort. And he says that he rather sheepishly said, I just did that. And so we finished the run and we went to set up another run. And he claims that I said to him, Charlie, have I ever told you about Hoot's Law or Gibson's Law? And it was, things may be bad right now, but you can make it worse. And so I came up with a policy that anytime I'm going to throw a switch, I'm going to put my hand on the switch and say, I'm going to throw this switch. Somebody else, either Steve Hawley, our flight engineer, or Charlie Bolden, has to look at it and say, I agree. And only then would I throw that switch. And every so often, I'd put my hand on the wrong switch just to make sure that they were really watching me and not just saying, okay, yeah, I agree. And that paid off, because on that mission, the one where I had killed my crew in training, we said, we're going to go the entire 6-day mission, and we're never going to miss a single switch. We missed one in the space of 6 days. So I guess that's pretty good.
We're recording this on July 5th, 2023. So here in a couple short months will be the last time the airplanes go around the pylons at Reno out in the desert. I'm talking to someone that's won the air race. Good Lord. I mean, flown in multiple different classes. I think everything but the T6. All that to say, Hoot, this is kind of the end of an era for that air race, and hopefully they're going to find some more new. I've heard of a couple different locations that they're thinking about moving it to. But just kind of wondering your thoughts on kind of the end of the era out there in Reno.
Well, I had mentioned I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer and a test pilot from the time I was young. I was fascinated by air racing as well. Air racing airplanes are such good-looking airplanes. They're sleek, they're powerful, they're fast. World-famous air racer Roscoe Turner had an old expression, and that was, there's no excuse for an airplane unless it's fast. And I guess I kind of felt the same way. I remember riding my bike to the library to go to the airplane section in the library and look at airplanes and air races. Lots of books on that. I also remember watching with my dad a movie with Clark Gable and Spencer Tracy and Myrna Loy called Test Pilot. And at the beginning of that movie, he was an air race pilot. And so I guess I was kind of enamored by, well, I know I was very much enamored by air racing as well. And I wanted to get into that. Now, I couldn't afford a P-51 Mustang because the price tag on those is in the millions, but I could afford a home-built Cassutt, C-A-S-S-U-T-T. Tom Cassutt was the designer. And in 1983, I bought a Cassutt that was, 12 years old at that point, badly in need of being rebuilt. And I spent a year rebuilding it. I flew it in some regional Texas races and got a little bit of experience. And one year, a friend of mine had 2 Formula One racers, and that's one of the classes, Formula One. And he couldn't race both of them, so he invited me to race his second Formula One racer, which I did in 1989. And I finished ahead of him in his other racer. So he should have switched that around. But anyway, that was the exposure that caused a number of years later. I had about 5 years of experience flying in some of the Texas races in Formula One. I got invited to fly a Hawker Sea Fury in the unlimited class. I remember I was asked, would you be interested in racing my Hawker Sea Fury in the unlimiteds? And I wanted to say, yeah, how much do I have to pay you to do that? I wound up racing altogether at Reno 18 years in 3 of the different classes. So Formula One, and then in the unlimited class. And then Reno came up with an idea to race jets. And so They didn't want some swept wing, delta wing, afterburning jet going around the course at 700 miles an hour. So they said it's got to be a straight wing jet and non-afterburning to keep the speeds moderate, although they aren't really moderate. They're 500 miles an hour, even with straight wing, non-afterburning jets. And the FAA had a little bit of nervousness about that, the idea of a jet going around that race course. And so Reno said, okay, hey, how about if we do this? We'll pick some experienced race pilots and we'll borrow jets for them and we'll let them do a jet race. So I got selected to take part in that as one of the first ones to do that. So we did that. We showed the FAA that, yeah, sure, you can do this. It's safe enough, we can do it. And so I wound up getting to fly in the jet races as well. So I flew in those three classes. I flew Formula One 1 year. I raced a Hawker Sea Fury named Riff Raff 10 years. And then after that, since I knew how to fly unlimiteds, and in particular Hawker Sea Furies, I got invited to fly the fastest Sea Fury that ever raced there, race number 232. And I flew that 3 different years, wound up with a second place overall in the unlimited category in that one. And then I raced the jets as well. And then I got invited to race probably the fastest air racer out there, a greatly modified P-51 Mustang named Strega. The last year that I got to air race, 2015, I won the unlimited championship in Strega.
What was that feeling like, coming down home pylon and just knowing, I mean, you knew, you've got people talking in your ear, you know you're going to win. That has just to be such a feeling of accomplishment.
When I passed the home pylon, I said to myself, wow, I think I did it. I wasn't positive because you don't know if a protest got lodged against you for the way you passed somebody. You don't know if you have maybe crossed a deadline at some point. You don't know if you got called for a pylon cut. So I parked in the winner's circle, but I still wasn't certain just because of the unknowns that could be out there waiting for you. But I will never forget, I had shut down Strega and the first 3 place airplanes parked there in the winner's circle out in front of the grandstands in front of all your thousands of screaming fans. I climbed out of the airplane and I was standing on the wing when I heard the announcer say, we have the word from the contest committee. We have a clean race, so we have a new national and world unlimited champion, Hoot Gibson. And at that point, I've got a smile about this big on my face because that's what I was waiting to hear. I thought I had won, and it turns out that airplane just ran away from everybody. I lapped everyone in the field except for the second place airplane. So that is the dominant racer out there is Strega. So I was lucky I got to race that airplane.
I'm guessing you had mentors and folks that you trusted and gave you advice when you got into air racing. What would you say to someone that is new or thinking about it once after 2023, when Reno finds a new airfield and a new place to go? What advice would you give to someone that's looking to get into it?
It's exciting. It's also hazardous. It is risky. I mentioned I raced Reno 18 years. 8 of those years, we lost a pilot. One of those years, 2007, we lost 3 pilots. So it is risky. It is hazardous. You can die doing this. And in fact, it's probably pretty easy to die doing it. It's probably a little more challenging to not die doing it. And so that's something to keep in mind. I know some of my friends from back in Texas that had Formula One racers as well. They were allowed to do that until there was an air race that I was flying in, and several of them were flying in. And there was a mid-air collision in that race. And at that point, I know one of the wives said to her husband, no, we can't do this again. Because when this mid-air collision happened, she thought it was her husband. And one of the racers crashed and died. And so it is hazardous. Now, it is exciting, but don't just leap into it without finding a mentor. Find somebody that you can ask a lot of questions about it, because you can reinvent the wheel yourself. Or you can take some coaching and a little bit of advice from somebody that has already invented that wheel, and they can help you so much. Now, in the Unlimiteds, we had a real asset out there at the Reno Air Races, a former Lockheed engineer named Pete Law. And he was such an expert on these big radial engines in particular, and these big piston engines, that are a breed apart, a real breed apart from, my little Continental 0200 that's in my Formula One racer. But these big engines with water injection, water methanol injection, and and all the things that go along with that, you really need somebody that knows an awful lot about it and get all the coaching and all the help you can out of somebody like that before you decide to leap into this.
Hoot, you mentioned, actually, it might have been I mentioned the airlines, talked about that earlier. You had an awesome career at Southwest Airlines. I'm kind of curious, how did you find your way to Southwest? I'm guessing people probably recognized you. People probably knew who you were when you were out on the road flying. But yeah, what was it like flying the 737?
Well, part of the situation that led me to Southwest Airlines was that we were moving to Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And okay, what am I experienced and good at? Well, they didn't need any astronauts in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. I don't know that they really needed any aeronautical engineers. I don't know that they needed test pilots. And so I had known so many Southwest Airlines pilots from my time in Houston all those years, and they were just like me. They were in this job not because it was a job. They were in this because they loved to fly. I remember I would ask, I'd meet a Southwest employee, and I'd say, hey, tell me something bad about Southwest. And they'd say, what did you just ask me? And I'd say, tell me something bad about Southwest. And they'd get this puzzled look on their face. They'd look at the sky, they'd look around a little bit, and they'd say, I can't think of anything bad to tell you about Southwest. And this wasn't just pilots. This was ops agents, ramp agents, pilots, of course, flight attendants. Everybody loved their company. Pilots were doing this because they loved to fly. So I needed another career. It was too early for me to retire. And so I said, okay, I can be a pilot for Southwest Airlines because I can live anywhere and commute to wherever my crew base is. And again, because I had such rave reviews out of everybody I asked about Southwest, I said, okay, I'm going to give it a go. So I'm going to apply there. I had some coaching from a couple of captains that I knew from my time there in Houston. And of course, that paid off. I got selected, and it wasn't a slam dunk because they really had their pick of aviators at Southwest Airlines. And I had to have something to get hired there that you didn't have to have at any other airline. I had to have my air transport pilot certificate, the ATP rating, and I also had to have a Boeing 737 type rating. So I had to go to flight safety and go through the Boeing 737 training to get a type rating in the Boeing 737 and also to get my ATP because I hadn't really needed it prior to that. I had to have both of those for them to look at my application. So you had to send that in with your application. At any other airline, only the captain has to have those two ratings, the ATP rating and the Boeing 737 type rating. So they have a little slogan that's kind of an unofficial slogan, and that is, we only hire captains. And I have to say, Southwest has an incredible safety record. They started up in 1971. They have had 2 fatalities to this day, and I think a significant part of that is that they are very picky about their pilots. And so it was a really great experience. Now, you wouldn't think, being a fighter guy that I was, that flying a big trash hauler like that around would be any fun. It was fun. It was a lot of fun. And I flew in weather the likes of which we weren't allowed to fly in the Navy. Some of the very low visibility approaches that we could fly in Southwest, we never flew in weather like that in the Navy. And so that was a real positive experience for me.
2011. I promise you don't remember this day, but I remember it vividly. I was flying with a friend in an RV-7. We were doing air-to-air photos of an air tractor with some ordnance on the bottom, doing some flight test stuff. I love photography. I love formation flying. It was a perfect mix. And then someone said, hey, Hoot Gibson's at the airport. And I said, no, there's no way. And you were there flying a Duke to go testify. And I don't even know what you were doing exactly, but that's one thing that I know that you've made, again, we talk about careers, another career of, is testifying as an aviation expert witness. Hoping maybe you could maybe tell me the other side of what happened that day after you got that time with my buddy Stan.
That was a 4th career or a 5th career. I'm not sure where we are now. But what happened was I got a phone call, this was in 1999, from a really accomplished lawyer named Mark Dombrov. At this point, I was flying for Southwest Airlines. So I had a couple years of experience in the 737. And he said, hey, do you have an opinion on the accident that happened at Pittsburgh, the Boeing 737 crash at Pittsburgh that was U.S. Airways crash? That was a rudder reversal hardover. I said, well, I'm not sure I know that much about it and all. And he said, well, I'm looking for an expert witness to be able to testify in defense of the airline. And why don't I send you some of the materials about this and have you take a look at it? I looked at it. I looked at the evidence that they had, and I said, oh my gosh, this was not the pilot's fault. And so, yes, I can help you defend U.S. Airways. And so that's what got me started in this. And he was such a mentor, such a teacher. He taught me the ropes on how to do that. Now, I think I had some experience that was valuable, and that was the experience of being an astronaut and being stuck in front of a TV camera and getting some kind of a hardball thrown at you by somebody of the press. And okay, think fast. And how do I answer this question and not make a fool of myself or not make a fool of NASA or the space program? And so I think that had been some fairly valuable experience. And I guess I did fairly well in that first case because when we won that case in a big way, in a big, huge way. And as we were at the Pittsburgh airport getting ready to get on our respective flights to fly back home, Mark Dombroff looked at me and he said, hey, did we hire you yet on the such and such case? And I said, no, sir. And he said, well, you're hired. And so I guess I had done fairly well. So from there, what happens is your name gets out there and other lawyers learn about you, other law firms learn about you, and all of a sudden you're getting called by other law firms. I've done that now for 25 years that I've been working as an expert witness. And most of the time we win. And that's not because of me, that's because of the team that I'm on. And I won't take a case unless I believe in it. There's a lot of money at stake because you get paid a lot for doing this. But I am not going to compromise any kind of honor or ideals by taking a case that I don't believe in. I can take whatever cases I want. I can turn down whichever ones I want. It's challenging because it can be a little bit of a chess match because the opposing counsel is going to say, well, would you agree with me that such and such is true? And you think about it and you go, well, yeah, okay, I can agree with you that that's true. Okay, and then based on that, then can you agree with me? And you have to be thinking ahead and saying, okay, where's he trying to take me? And I remember I was in a deposition one time and the opposing counsel said, well, okay, and at this point you assume that such and such. And I said, you're saying I assume something. I didn't assume anything. I concluded after very extensive analysis. And so they are tricky and they're clever, and they will try to put words in your mouth, and you have to be ready to not let them put words in your mouth. So it's been a challenging kind of profession, but it's also been rewarding. The fun part, though, has always been whatever it is, I need to go find one of those and go fly it, like the case with the Duke that you mentioned. And that had been a case of asymmetric flaps. It was a fatal accident where the pilot had put his flaps down and he can't really see his right flap very well sitting in the left seat. And he took off and lost control of the airplane. And so the fun part for me has always been, okay, I've got to go fly that kind of airplane. And so that's been the rewarding and the fun part of it.
Hoot, this has been truly a pleasure. 2 wrap-ups I always like to ask. First off is the story behind the call sign. So obviously everyone knows you as Hoot, even though your first name is Robert.
Well, most Gibsons are going to get Hoot because there had been a movie star cowboy back in the late 20s, 30s. He had been world champion cowboy, I think, in 1912. And, you got to ask the question, well, then how did he get the nickname? Well, I happen to know the answer. It turns out when he was a teenager, he had worked for a drugstore chain that used to exist in the U.S., and it was called Owl Drugs or Owl Drugstores. And so his buddies got to calling him Hoot Owl, and the part of that stuck was the Hoot part. So if your last name's Gibson, you're going to get Hoot for a nickname. Now, where I really got it branded into me was when I showed up aboard the Coral Sea, April of 1972, to join the Sundowners, Fighter Squadron 111. I was 25 and a half years old then. The ops officer said, well, have you got a nickname? And I said, oh, yes, sir, it's Bob. And he said, no, come on. I mean a real nickname. And I said, well, occasionally I've been called Hoot. Bang, that was it. I was Hoot Gibson from that point on, early April of 1972. Lieutenant J.G. Hoot Gibson went on my canopy of my Phantom. Hoot Gibson went on my name tag. Hoot Gibson went on my coffee cup. And so ever since then, I've been Hoot Gibson. And my dad told me that he had the nickname for a while. He flew for the Army Air Corps in the 1930s. And he told me that he had occasionally had the nickname Hoot. So it's kind of an automatic nickname.
Hoot, thank you again, truly, for taking so much time. This has been, I tell folks the reason why I do a podcast is I get to interview my heroes. And that is absolutely true. Folks I've flown with in the squadron at VT-10 or back in the 53 back in the day, all the way to someone like you who, good Lord, I don't know what you probably haven't flown. But I always want to end these the same way. And number one, that's gratitude. Thank you to you. Thank you to our mutual friend, Mike, for putting us together and making this happen. But you get the last word. Anything maybe I didn't ask or anything you want to say? Over to you, sir.
Oh, golly. Aviation has shaped my entire life. And it's always fun when I get to talk to my fellow aviators. So I go out on the road and I do a lot of public speaking and a lot of talking and all. The most pleasurable events that I get to do, and the ones that I have the most in common with, are when I get to talk to my fellow aviators. And so it's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure to get to talk to a fellow naval aviator.
Thanks, Hoot.
My pleasure.
Thanks, as always, for taking the time and tuning in to Safe on Deck. Hope you enjoyed this episode. It shouldn't need to be said, but just in case, I'll say it. The views and opinions presented on Safe on Deck are my own, and those of my guests, and do not represent the official policy or position of the Department of Defense, the Department of the Navy, or its components. Be well and fly safe out there. See you next time.